We are back with a part 2 of our Hadza adventure. Paul Saladino joins me yet again. We launched the first one, which talked all about our experience, what we learned from it, what we're taking away from it. But you guys had great feedback and you had a lot of amazing questions. So we dive into it today, all about, education, more specific nutrition questions, a lot about movement, how do you train? And basically our concept just goes back to the fact that we're all living in a zoo and there's ways to get out of it. Doors unlocked, and it's our choice to walk through. It's sort of a concept that we touch on a lot in this episode, but we dive into a lot of you guys' great questions. We probably answered about 30 questions or so. So thank you for submitting those, and I hope you guys enjoy this latest installment of us chatting about our trip to see the Hadza in Tanzania.
One clap. Anthony, thanks for coming back on the podcast, brother.
Here we are again, reunited.
Reunited in Costa Rica. Feels good, brother.
It does.
Adventure buddy. If you guys are listening to this podcast, you should check out the video on YouTube. Anthony and I are seated in a pretty beautiful spot in Santa Teresa, Costa Rica. We got to surf together this morning. And yeah, it's a good life here. We're definitely going to talk about similarities between life in rural Costa Rica, extremely rural, remote Costa Rica, and life with the Hadza. But
it's been a crazy couple of weeks, man. We were like, was it 3 weeks ago? We were there.
Uh-huh.
Then crazy travel coming back. I was stuck in Miami. You came pretty much straight here.
Yep.
And I met you here. And
yeah.
then,
it's been an adventure
a lot
since.
of different perspectives.
Yeah, it's been an adventure ever since. And maybe at the end of this podcast, we'll talk about the blue zones and the fact that Nicoya, Costa Rica is a blue zone, or a supposed blue zone.
The peninsula where we're at.
Yeah, yep. And there's a town in the peninsula called Nicoya that we can talk about. So the adventure continues. There's always things to be learned everywhere. But I thought we would start this part 2 podcast about our Africa adventures. You guys can find part 1 on Anthony's podcast, which is The Natural State, or my podcast, which is called Fundamental Health. If you guys want to hear that podcast, that was an action-packed, over 2-hour episode about our adventures. We're going to fill in the gaps here with questions that you guys asked. But wanted to start with an article that you found and sent me. We'll link to it in the show notes. The title of the article, incidentally, this was published when we were in Africa. Right. Published on February the 11th, 2021. It's in Nature Immunology. There's actually 2 articles here. And the first article is titled, Urban Living in Healthy Tanzanians is Associated with an Inflammatory Status Driven by Dietary and Metabolic Changes. So that's a fascinating title, and we'll dig into a little bit of what this article found. And then we'll talk about a corollary article that had some editorialization. So what do you make? What is your take on this article that we found in Nature Immunology? And it's in Tanzania, so it's basically comparing urban people in Moshi.
Exactly what we saw.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the associated content here says fiber-poor Western diets fuel inflammation.
Right.
So another summary said, when compared, the rural population consumes high grains, lots of fiber, fruits and vegetables primarily.
And less saturated fat.
And the urban population consumes higher saturated fat and more processed foods. And so the conclusions drawn from here, we haven't dug into everything completely yet, but it shows, okay, when more urban, more inflammation. We would agree with that. We saw people, we went over this in the last podcast, we saw people that just looked far unhealthier. They smelled worse, they were overweight, their skin quality was terrible. And it was pretty obvious without doing blood work that people were unhealthier in the urban areas. They weren't eating real food, but they were not eating more saturated fat. And this is unequivocal. I mean, we saw it with our own eyes. And they were not eating less fiber. If anything, they were eating more fiber. So these are 2 points to sort of dig into. I mean, we talked about this a lot in the previous podcast episode, so go check that out if you haven't caught up on that one. But the Hadza could pretty much eat 0 fiber.
It's very low.
They chew the tubers and spit them out. I'd say get some fiber. I don't even know is it honeycomb even fibrous, or just wax?
It's wax. I don't even think it's
count as fiber.
I don't even think it counts as fiber. No, I don't think there's much fiber there.
Well, so they get some in the berries.
Maybe a little bit in berries and a little bit in baobab.
Some in the baobab, yeah.
That's about it.
But that's soluble fiber. It's not like the big leafy greens.
No.
Heart-healthy whole grains like the article summary suggests. So when you move to more urban areas, your reliance on animal products goes down, so you have to get your energy from somewhere. So typically what we saw was the dependency on corn and then also wheat to some extent skyrockets. And so people, when we go to the small villages, you get far more ugali, which is just ground up cornmeal mixed with water made into a porridge. When you go to things like, we were in Karatu, which was a small town, and as well as Arusha, there's maybe like one meat stand. There's like 10 convenience stores, white bread, top to bottom, like the most shelf-stable sort of thing. So like, if you want to talk about whole grains or fiber, far and away, more consumption in urban areas, at least what we saw.
Yeah, and more vegetable oils in the urban areas and much less saturated fat. We told the story in the first podcast about our tour guide, the guy who organized all of our travels, Gasper, hearing from his physician in Tanzania, in Arusha, that he should not eat meat and associated saturated fat because those are the things that cause diabetes. That is essentially verbatim what he relayed to us. And so what do the people in the cities in Tanzania, this article in Nature Immunology is specifically looking at Moshi, which is a town at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. It's about 2 hours from Arusha, where we were when we were in the quote city. But the people in the cities are they must be eating a lot more vegetable oil. We saw it everywhere we turned. You could get potatoes fried in vegetable oil, and there were plastic containers of vegetable oil, seed oil, everywhere in these little roadside stands next to fruit and, watermelon and papaya and mango.
Do you remember the photo I took? It was a big carton of sunflower oil.
Yes.
I looked at that the other day when I was going through my photos. It just looked like sludge, like this weird brown toxic sludge. It was expired over 2 years ago.
You saw the expiration?
That's what it says on the thing.
Oh,
expiration date over 2 years ago. So obviously we don't want to consume any of these rancid seed oils to begin with. But when they're expired in plastic containers sitting outside in African heat, 2 years past their expiration date, like what? This is the problem, not the saturated fat. We were in a grocery store.
In a
aisle, top to bottom, super, super wide, massive amount of seed oil.
Seed oil.
And then we looked, there was like this tiny little area of tallow they call beef oil. And it was cheaper. Like just based upon the grocery store shelves, they do not eat more saturated fat.
And what we saw and what I saw living with Gasper, he took me to his house to have lunch, and I had to say, please don't cook anything in seed oil. And he was like, okay, you want the animal fat? And I said, yes, I really want the animal fat.
Do they have it?
Well, he did. It was all the barbecue, which was kind of the grisly bits of cattle. It was cow meat, like the worst parts of the cow. So like the grisly bits, which was fine for me because it was high in collagen.
The worst?
Yeah.
Who's deciding what the...
the least desirable pieces. We had barbecue, which is just grilled meat. But as you saw, some of the barbecue that we had was pretty savage.
It was gnarly.
It was very chewy. There were pieces of stomach, all of these things in the barbecue. That's a whole separate story, but there were very chewy bits in the barbecue. But I had to tell them and really request from Gasper, don't use seed oils. I don't want bread. And on his table in his house, like I said in the first podcast, was margarine, white bread with seed oils, and they were definitely eating ugali and grains. Corn has high fiber. And this is just all to highlight the fact that in these articles, there are people doing research with a lot of editorialization now, making the conclusion in these two associated studies in Nature Immunology that the observed inflammatory changes in the urban living Tanzanians is associated with a, quote, fiber-poor Western diet. Now,
with saturated fat.
Right, high saturated, that is verbatim from one of these abstracts. It is a high saturated fat, fiber-poor Western diets. And it's pretty clear that they're insinuating there that the lack of fiber is what's causing this problem.
They eat more fiber.
And apparently they eat even more fiber than the people who are truly living in the bush or these other people who are living, or the same or more than the rural Tanzanians. And so this is exactly what Anthony and I experienced and talked about in the first podcast, that there is a lot of research from Justin Sonnenberg and others looking at the Hadza microbiome and saying the Hadza eat tons of fiber. The Hadza specifically have been held up as a, quote, plant-based group of hunter-gatherers, which is an absurdity if you spend any time with them. And they've been purported in these articles by Justin Sonnenberg to eat 150 grams of fiber per day or thereabouts, which is inconceivable, to quote the Princess Bride.
They wouldn't be able to.
No, they couldn't I don't even know how they would even get that much fiber.
Maybe if they collected all the baobab and one person ate all of it,
Or
they could find.
Or they didn't spit out the tubers, which are clearly meant to be spit out. It doesn't make any sense. They're not eating bark. There's just not that much fiber for them to eat.
Yeah, there's like literally, even if they wanted to, there's no availability for them to do so.
No, there's very little fiber in their diet. And this just goes back to this overarching conceptualization in Western medicine that fiber is needed for a healthy microbiome, something that I will be debating Stephen Gundry about in a future podcast on my podcast. So stay tuned for that, guys. And that without fiber, all sorts of inflammatory changes happen in the gut. And this is something that both you and I were aware of before we went. There's plenty of literature to debate that, to debunk that, but we see it firsthand. And it's just so interesting to see this paper about the Tanzanians. It's published while we're in Tanzania. They clearly show that the urban people have more inflammation, and you and I will draw a completely different possible hypothesis for that than these people would. And there's so much editorializing, it's quite frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their biases, which is totally fine. And I understand that we probably, to some extent, have them as well. But the sheer amount of misleading correlations here, it just perpetuates the parroting of this information, which is completely false. And this is why I said on the last podcast, I'm not going to trust anything anymore unless I see it for myself, which it's tough to do. Like, I now see this stuff, and I'm like, well, what happens now when even researchers are in a lab with mice? If you actually go to these places and see with your own eyes how obvious it is that the urbanized people have less saturated fat and more fiber, how can you write that and publish it in a journal as respected as Nature Immunology on nature.com?
My suspicion is that, and this may have parallels with our current political sort of zeitgeist, but and the reporting of information across social media and the New York Times and Twitter and Facebook, that there is a prevailing narrative that these journals want to substantiate. And my suspicion, which is only a suspicion,
to not be canceled for having controversial points of view.
Yes, that I don't think Nature Immunology would publish your paper if you did not play into this sort of viewpoint. That you would be essentially canceled if you said, urban living healthy Tanzanians associated with an inflammatory status driven by dietary and metabolic changes. And you said, there are many changes that happen in the urban people in Tanzania. They have more seed oils. They really don't have any difference in fiber, or even they eat more fiber. Is it possible that the fiber narrative is wrong? Or, we don't actually know what causes this, but we need to look at it more rather than just having it a foregone conclusion that is a, quote, fiber-poor Western diet that fuels inflammation.
And I mean, I agree with that. There is such a thing as a Western diet. Like I've traveled quite a lot around the world.
Yes.
And generally speaking, when you go to especially more third world countries, places that are still developing, their reliance on vegetable oil is insane. Like, it always shocks me how available it is and how cheap it is in bulk, giant containers. They're cooking everything with it immediately. And refined grains. These two things, once they come in, just replace immediately the culture. And people are so used to it, whether that's from their doctor saying so, or it's cheaper, or whatever the reason is, easier to cook with, doesn't matter. Once it becomes part of the culture, it never leaves again. And I think that that's a part where those are the things we need to be looking at. Like, what actually changes? It's not more. It's not less fiber. It's not more saturated fat. It's more seed oils generally, more refined starches,
and more sugars,
more shelf stable processed foods,
more preservatives, more dyes. Yeah. And that's such an important point, that Anthony and I are not debating that a Western diet causes disease. We are simply asking mainstream researchers and physicians and all of you listening to this to not buy into the narrative, lock, stock, without questioning it, that the problem with the Western diet is the lack of fiber, because that doesn't seem to be a consistent thing. But what we do observe in Tanzania and the Hadza versus the urbanites in the same country, and this is one of the reasons we went, is less saturated fat and more seed oils and more processed grains and more sugars in these Westernized diets. Therein lies the problem.
Yeah, and I don't think either of us have the answer. Like, what is it exactly that is a tipping point here that leads to all the chronic diseases that we have? We don't have the answers exactly either. We're trying to figure it out, but it's very clearly not fiber and saturated fat, as these studies point out.
Yes, as these studies would try and point the finger of culpability toward.
Right.
Yeah, and I've talked about this so many times in my podcast. It's like The Usual Suspects, that movie. And who is Kaiser Soze, right? There's a lineup of people, and one of the people is saturated fat, and one of the people is seed oils, and one of the people is fructose, and it's like, and everybody keeps freaking pointing to saturated fat, and you and I are going, I think the other guy is Kaiser Soze, and I think that seed oils are getting off when they're actually guilty, and they're the people walking away at the end of the movie with, you know, who have the limp, and they're just pretending. If you guys haven't seen the end of The Usual Suspects, you'll understand that.
I haven't seen it, but I can surmise what it's all about right now.
Yeah.
And yes, this is what's happening.
It's a good movie, dude. You got to see The Usual Suspects.
It's tough. It's tough to just see. I mean, we are in a really small town right now. We'll probably get into a little bit later around how it's kind of similar to our time in rural Africa.
Yes.
Being 4.5 hours down a dirt road, essentially, this tiny town. People are eating basically what grows around here. Yeah, there's some seed oils for sure. There are trucks that get here, but the reliance is not the same as in Karatu or some of these places that get dependent on westernization. They get dependent on the energy. They get dependent on the cheap calories, which of course, yes, they want to survive. You're going to need to, if the animal production goes down, you're going to have to get the calories from somewhere. And they're going to go to the cheapest point. And that is processed sugar, processed carbohydrates, processed grains, processed oils.
Yep. And one of the things that I've always struggled with, because the more I look into this, the stronger my conviction becomes that seed oils are very harmful for humans. I don't want to say that I have complete certainty of that, but I have a very strong suspicion.
They're the things that are furthest away from what's available in nature.
Yeah.
And I think that whenever you go away from the natural environment of the organism, that's when you get into trouble. And even last night, so we've been drinking a lot of coconuts here.
Oh, so many.
They're called pipas. So I didn't know if you were aware, but the small ones are very different from the large coconuts. Mm-hmm. The large coconuts you're not supposed to drink, apparently, because they're much harder to crack into. So we went to this amazing grocery store down here called Green World. They have these things called pipas. So they're coconuts that you can just basically tap and put a straw in and suck them out. They're delicious.
Drink the coconut water.
Yeah, drink the coconut water. And they didn't have any. And then, so Martha and I went to grab these larger ones that were with the fruit. We grabbed those, and they're like, no, these aren't the same. Like, whatever, screw it, we're going to try them out. So we did. We opened one up. They taste fine. Just they're harder to crack into. And then it was like, hey, you know what? Let's just try to make some coconut milk, because why not? We're here, and I've never done that before, so let's do it. Scooped out the flesh of the coconut, blended it out for a couple minutes, used a strainer to strain it out. And it was so much work. I'm like, man, should humans be drinking coconut milk or nut milks? Like, the amount of energy and input it took to make this thing was so hard. If I didn't have a blender blending it for 5 minutes, there's no way I would be able to get a milk out of the coconut.
Oh, no.
Period. I've seen it done. I've seen some of this stuff done in Thailand, where they have like these metal presses, a little more rudimentary. They're getting more oil out of it than milk. You look at grains. Okay, yeah, they grow. You can do some processing, like the toga we saw. They take corn, they grind it with a stone. Okay, it's kind of close to like what can grow there. You look at processed sugar. We had sugar cane. Cut off, eating it. Yeah, you can grind that up, dry it out, get some sugar from that. But we were talking about seed oils. You're talking about canola. What the fuck is a canola to begin with?
It's a rapeseed, right?
Right. The tiny seeds, cotton seeds.
Not even food.
And then, like, the availability of taking those seeds, harvesting them from the plant, and then getting them to an oil you can use is so tremendously hard. So if you actually go on YouTube and search how it's made, canola oil, I don't know if you've seen this video, it's like 5 or 10 minutes long.
It's a long process.
It is frightening how in-depth and disgusting it is. You need a factory to make this thing. You do not need a factory to make sugar. You do not need a factory to make refined grain. You do need crazy factories and industrialization to make refined oils, thus much further from an actual environment. That's my hypothesis, is that takes us further from our natural state of health.
Yeah, I like that. And it's funny because this past week I went down the honey rabbit hole because I've been grappling with the idea of sucrose, which is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, versus honey. And thinking, when we were with the Hadza, we ate honey and it was amazing. And there's lots of evidence from our observations and many people working with the Hadza and other tribes like the Mbuti pygmies, that eating a lot of your calories from honey do not lead to metabolic dysfunction. It clearly does not lead to a problem. And so I've been grappling with this because within the ketogenic space, there are certainly those who have thrown honey under the bus saying it is equivalent, or essentially posting things to the effect that is equivalent to Coca-Cola. Like honey is pure sugar.
Well, we talked about biases earlier.
Right.
We know that Paul has bias from Big Honey.
This is a joke.
the most of his actual resources come from is from Big Honey.
I'm sponsored by Big Honey. This is not true, guys. You know what's funny is I actually learned there is something called the National Honey Board. I am not sponsored by them. This is
disclose it.
There are no financial disclosures from honey. I just happen to think that it's a fascinating food. And now that I've eaten bee larvae and actual honey from the tree called quinoa from stingless bees and had this pollen, and there's video of this on my Instagram, guys, it's amazing. I am even more of a honey sort of a proponent, or at least someone who's very passionate about honey. So I found a bunch of studies which I talked about in a Controversial Thoughts podcast on my podcast, which is Fundamental Health. I'll just mention one or two of those. We'll put them in the show notes. But I found it to be so fascinating. There was a head-to-head comparison of honey and dextrose and sucrose. The title is actually Honey Compared with Dextrose and Sucrose. So honey compared with sucrose would be more accurate than comparing honey with dextrose. Dextrose is a glucose polymer. Sucrose is going to have a mix of glucose and fructose. So that's more like what honey is. But it was fascinating because in that paper, they showed that honey versus sucrose did different things in terms of triglycerides. And if you dig into it, you find out that honey actually contains nitric oxide metabolites. And this speaks to your point that, and this is, I'd always kind of not understood this simplification, but I do think that the refining, processing of foods gives us foods that are evolutionary and consistent. And I just hope that doesn't sound too elementary, but you find in this paper that the paper's from the Journal of Medicinal Food, title is Identification of Nitric Oxide Metabolites in Various Honeys, Effects of Intravenous Honey on Plasma and Urinary Nitric Oxide Metabolites Concentrations. And what they found was when they infused honey into a sheep, IV, they saw increased nitric oxide metabolites. Nitric oxide is a critical molecule, guys, for endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which has to do with endothelial function and vasodilatation. And I found this to be so fascinating that when you heated the honey, the nitric oxide metabolites decreased in all kinds of honey. That ultraviolet exposure decreased nitric oxide metabolites, and that the darker the honey was, the more nitric oxide metabolites there were. This honey we had in Tanzania at Lake Eyasi with the Hadza was brightly colored, it was iridescent, and it was dark, rich honey, and it was as raw gets. And so this is just an interesting idea for me that maybe I really believe that honey is more than just sugar because of these nitric oxide metabolites. It speaks to the same point. If you take something and you just really process it, evolutionarily, our body's never seen that.
Well,
it's not expecting it.
Yeah, one of the things I went to your place like a couple months ago, and I know that you were talking about, okay, does honey lead to these problems in metabolically healthy individuals? Does it lead to metabolic problems that like a la Coca-Cola? You were doing a lot of experiments over the last year. I think that the first time you started eating it, I was actually surprised last February when we were in Utah. You were spooning it out like a madman. And like since then, you've been like, hey, look at this like craft honey I got from this place. Like still has the little bits of the comb and the bees in it and stuff like that. And like even when you get a honey in a jar, that's far more refined than how we're eating with the Hadza. The fact that they're just literally grabbing the combs and eating them with the bee larvae still in there, that's a different thing. And this just goes to show another point of, I think that I generally look for easy to follow heuristics in nutrition. And it's tough to have every single corner always have the best evidence and be covered. But generally speaking, the more refined a food it is, I'm pretty comfortable saying that it's going to be worse for human health, no matter along the spectrum. If you're talking about honey, if you're talking about sugar, if you're talking about grains, if you're talking about oil, if you're talking about anything, the more refined it is, the worse it's going to be for human health. The problem is that we've noticed here, some of the questions that we've gotten, people are so far removed from nature, they don't know what unrefined means. And this is a word that I choose specifically, refined versus processed. There's this whole debate, even like really smart people are like, oh, well, chewing is processed and like cutting things is processed. Cooking is processed. So like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean processed here? And I think like, when you talk about refinement, you're talking about extracting parts of the actual food, distilling them, and then you can process them, add stuff, refinement again, oils, seeds. You have to add solvents to get the actual fatty acids out. You have to filter it. Again, you're refining it to the actual fatty acid from a seed. And then the same thing with honey. Like even when it goes to jar, you heat it, it's more refinement.
That's why you want raw.
Right. And that's why you want raw. So like there's going to be a spectrum to probably every single food that you can think of, including animal products. For sure.
Agree.
I mean, looking at eating the collagenous tissue that we were talking about, the barbecue thing, versus getting a collagen supplement. Very different things. And it doesn't mean that collagen is bad, doesn't mean whatever. It's just all this stuff is on a spectrum. And I think spending more time in nature and seeing, for us, going to Hadza, this is one of the things that was fascinating. Like, what does an unrefined, complete nutrition look like? Like, even you are eating honey out of a glass jar. It's like, we can't really live that way anymore. And this is a big question we have. Like, does it make sense to go back to a tribal way of living? I don't think we can. Like, we can't just go hunt our own food and get honey. And like, it doesn't work in normal civilization. But getting into nature, seeing how things are done, getting closer to food production, getting closer to the food system, seeing these levels of refinement will help you make decisions around like, oh, this is food, this is not food. And there's a lot of nuance there. It's like, does honey in a glass jar that you get that's raw, is that bad for you? No. Is the honey that you get at the Hadza probably better? Yes. But can you easily grab out of a hive every time you want honey? Absolutely not. We can't live that way. So we have like look each food individually and see where we can go back in that spectrum and like get to the most common, like basically the common denominator of like, this is the most unrefined version of this food as possible. And this is why I've always argued that a carnivore diet is so easy, because animal products by themselves, if you just get a cut of an animal product, this is as unrefined as you can get, period.
Yeah.
It's really hard to actually refine animal products.
You can make it into like bologna and lunch meats.
It's really expensive.
Yeah.
To get animal products and refine them.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I think it's a great heuristic. So I think Anthony and I would agree on that completely. If you take nothing else from this podcast, guys, eat the least amount of refined foods all the freaking time. And I just want to piggyback on that and extend it. What bothers me about the communities that you and I rotate in, whether it's the carnivore community or the keto community or an animal-based community, is people try and reverse engineer a lot of this. And I think that with a reductionist perspective, and that fails repeatedly. And that's what I like to point out with the honey. Because you can look at this refinement, and there's a good amount of evidence that isolated fructose or isolated sucrose and table sugar is probably not that good for humans.
Yeah, high fructose corn syrup in honey, they're not the same thing.
Exactly.
Again, looking at the spectrum of refinements, you could probably get it from honey. You can probably get high fructose corn syrup from honey. I know that the vast majority is from corn. Like, can you take a rock and get the high fructose corn syrup out like you do with a meal? Absolutely not. But to say, like you said, some people in the keto community say, like, oh, it's the same thing.
Because
sugar is a sugar.
Sugar.
Fructose is fructose.
Booger is booger.
Booger is booger. But yeah, it's.
And that's what I want to guard against, because I don't think it works in reverse. Right? We can clearly say refinement is not good for humans evolutionarily, and we can try and show data like the study with nitric oxide metabolites that are being removed. And I'm sure that in sugarcane, which I will go down that rabbit hole too, there are beneficial things. I bet there are beneficial things in sugarcane that mitigate the damaging effects of sucrose, or that works synergistically, and that sucrose is not damaging for humans in its, quote, natural form, in its natural state. But you can't go in reverse. And it doesn't mean then that we can say, or that we should be quick to say, because that food contains glucose and fructose, it's not good for humans. Because fructose gets absolutely shit on, and it kills me. Because the Hadza would never not eat berries when they found them. And our ancestors would never not eat berries. We are here in Costa Rica. The papaya are out of this world. They're so good. And they grow on trees literally right outside of our complex. At the bottom of this complex, there's a tree growing mangoes, wild. And I went down there at the pool and had a mango from the tree. Our ancestors would have eaten that 100% of the time.
Yeah.
There's no way they would not have. And I really believe that millions of years of evolution, and we can talk about this later in the podcast, of consuming fruit, it just seems essentially, again, let's just use the word because it's so good, inconceivable that many years of eating something and it would be counterproductive to our vitality.
Right.
So,
and again, unrefined. You get the food in its whole form. It's a local food. It's here, and you eat it.
There's no technology to refine it.
Yeah. It's your teeth. Like that's how you refine it.
But you could take that mango and put it on a truck and take it to a factory in San Jose, and they could heat it and boil it and squeeze it and make mango juice out of it.
Or dried mango, stuff like that. Like,
with sulfites added. Yeah. So, I think this is a great segue to one of the questions you got, which is a good one that we should maybe just dig into a little bit before I move on to the rest of these questions that you guys submitted, which was essentially based on what you guys saw in Tanzania, how can we incorporate this into our life today, right? Which I think is one of the most relevant questions. And you touched on this a little bit. And I think what I heard you say was be in nature more, eat less refined foods.
The separation of humans from nature, I think, I just keep coming back to, is the number one problem that we have. Like that, if only humans went back to nature and spent more time in it, and not in a way that's like go in a park in a city. That's not nature. Actual ecosystems. An ecosystem where we came from, where we've completely separated and destroyed. That is the problem. Everything ties back to that. Our problems with mental health, our problems with physical health, which is sort of like what we care about, right? That's why we're doing this. That's why we're doing this podcast.
Exactly.
That's why we went on this trip. It's why we're here now. It's like it's a very easy place to be healthy. And all of these problems in mental and physical health stem from our separation from nature, period. That's my perspective, at least.
I agree with you.
And like, how do you incorporate that? I mean, there's just so much nuance to that question, depending on an individual's life and where they live. Like, if you live in New York City versus if you live here in Costa Rica, those are gonna be very different answers. But if you like have no concept of what we're talking about, if you've never gone camping or have any sort of like survival skills, which I realized when we were out with the Hadza, I think I talked about this last time. It was fascinating to see them work with just one knife and like what they could produce. Like, man, I'm so far removed, even though I think like I'm always trying to get outside and be outside as much as possible. But that removal is the same thing as an animal going to a zoo. Like, yeah, you can go to a park and sort of like mimic what it should be like. Just like there are twigs and branches when you put a frog inside of a glass case. Doesn't mean it's the natural habitat.
Terrarium, yeah.
It's not the same thing. And there's another question that was tying here now. Like,
perfect.
What do the Hadza have to do? Like, what do they do to be happy? Nothing. Exist in their natural environment. And like, happiness just isn't a thing. Just like the same way I view health. Like, health isn't a consideration for anything. Like, I saw monkeys in the trees walking around eating leaves yesterday morning. They don't have to worry about health like we do. They don't have to worry about happiness like we do. But when you take an animal or an organism out of its natural environment and put it into something artificial, or humans out of nature, it's the same thing. We have seen this in research. Animals in cages, animals in a zoo, get depressed, get fat, get lazy, lose their mission and their like purpose to hunt. Like, they'll throw in animals and lions will just sit there and be like, whatever. It's the same thing that happens to humans. Like, we are living in a zoo at all times. You living in your house, you having an office building, I'm sorry to say, like, we're all in cages, period. Now, do I know how to get back? Like, there's this pipe dream of like, are we going to be able to be like co-living tribes? It's impossible. I don't know where the return to home is. I don't. I have no idea. I've been thinking about a lot over the last 4 weeks, but I think that that's an important thing to think about. Of like, how can I change my environment to be more in nature, more normal? I mean, even like thinking about these couches that we're sitting in right now, if you guys can't see on YouTube, are a little bit lower than a normal, let's say, American couch. And I've been trying to, after seeing the Hadza, for example, thinking about our movement environment. There's nothing that they sit on that's 2 feet off the ground. There's nothing at a right angle. They do tend to sit on tiny little rocks and little logs, which I do at the beach all the time here, but you're in a full squat all of the time. All of the time. They're either lying on a rock or sitting on a twig, or just sitting on nothing, just in a full squat. So there's so many slices here of like nutrition, eat things that are unrefined, real local foods. I've been saying that for a long time. Movement, people ignore this. There's like, okay, how do you move back to that? I think like the most extreme example, which is like, I'm not even at this point, I'm not a crazy freak, even though I think about this stuff all the time, is like, remove the furniture out of your house.
I love that idea.
Put stuff you can hang on.
Do you know Aaron Alexander?
Yeah.
The Align podcast? So I've had Aaron on my podcast, guys. He's great. Check him out. He's really an advocate, and I love this. It'll save you thousands of dollars on furniture. No furniture in your house. Just sit on the freaking floor with a table that's low.
Yeah, or have yoga block, have something lower. Yeah. Like you can progress. I mean, this is the thing too. Like 4 weeks ago, I would say I squat quite a lot. I work on my movement pretty diligently. And for me to hang out in a squat like Hadza is difficult. So it's like, man, I need to work on that. I need to be at a point where I can just pop in a squat and hang out for 10 minutes at any given time. When we had lunch that one time, I'm like, shit, I can't sit in the squat like they do. Like, why is that the case? And now, after 4 weeks, it's gotten much, much better. I wouldn't recommend just getting rid of everything immediately and then trying to be in a full squat. Like, that's actually terrible. Like, not have that graded exposure with movement is like really dangerous, actually, in times. But it's progression back to a mean. Like, just the same thing with people if they're eating complete Western diet. It's really hard to switch and just eat carnivore, for example, for a lot of people, to make these extreme shifts. And this is where I think people get a little overexcited about, oh, the Hadza live like this. We should just completely go back. In relationships, in work, in movement, in nutrition, it's like, it's okay to take a slower journey back. You make one shift at a time, change your environment, do this thing, hang up a pull-up bar in between doors and hang when you walk through. Good. Now then remove your chair. Work 10 minutes at a time in this one position instead of, sitting. And I mean, it's another thing around like standing. They didn't stand in place for a long time. People are like, oh, standing desks are better than sitting desks. I disagree. I literally have a doctorate in movement, and I'm like, this is something I completely disagree with. You put extension load in your low back, that's terrible for you. But yeah, I mean,
squatting desks. We need squatting desks.
You don't have to worry about health. You don't have to worry about happiness when you're in a natural environment. We are so far from a conceivable natural environment that even it spins my head time and time again, even though I've been thinking about this for over a decade. So it's hard. I can't go live in the woods. It's too weird. And like an impossibility. We were talking about this a couple weeks ago. Like you can't just go hunt outside of Austin in the woods and kill people's animals and eat them. There are very few plants that grow there as well that you'd be able to eat even if you wanted to.
There's very few fruit. There's very little fruit.
So yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's one I'll be chewing on for a really long period of time. Of how can we return to the normal state of humans without completely disrupting society?
I think that is the question that you and I are both asking. And I love that there was a segue to the other awesome question that I thought one of your fans, one of your readers asked, what about the happiness? But I think that you and I both started in some ways by answering the question, how can we return, by looking at diet. Mm. And for both of us, it's gone much beyond diet. For me, I call that hashtag the remembering. I think for you, it's just part of your lifestyle. But the reason that I got interested in a carnivore diet was, how can we go back? How can we go back to where we've been? And along the way, I've certainly realized, just like you, that there's so much more than diet. I think it starts with diet and a few other things, but then there's movement, sunlight, and we're trying to do it right now here in Costa Rica. But I just want to mention for people, because I want to disarm this concern people may have, that you don't need to be, I guess I'm just afraid that people are going to see Anthony and I sitting on this nice balcony in Costa Rica and say, must be nice, you wealthy, affluent guys. And I just want you guys to know that both Anthony and I are very simple men.
Oh, yeah.
That we probably haven't washed the shirts that we're sitting in right now for 5 days. I have one pair of shorts with me on this trip and a pair of board shorts. I haven't worn shoes in 7 days. And that any of us can find simplicity and get back to nature with a few changes to your lifestyle that are not necessarily financially.
You ever talking about saving money by not having furniture?
Insurmountable, yeah. Yeah, exactly. You don't have to have furniture. And what do you need a 5,000 square foot house for if you're just going to sit on the floor all the time?
Right.
Build a house that's 1,000 square feet with a 1,000 square foot balcony or a big space to be outside. Anyway, that's just one little aside that I wanted to mention. But I love this question of what do the Hadza do to be happy? And I love your response, which is they don't have to do anything to be happy. Their basic fundamental state is happiness, because they live a life like humans have always lived. That's one of the coolest things that we saw. They sleep outside, they poop outside, we'll talk about that. They sit around a fire with their friends, they hunt, they have things to do, they have a purpose, they're in nature, they get sunlight, and they eat unrefined food, generally speaking. As we talked about in the first podcast, they are eating some refined food in the form of ugali. Unfortunately, the missionaries are bringing them. But I think that I love your statement here that when humans and other animals are in their, quote, natural state, Happiness is the default mode.
Right.
And you are listening to this, you live in a zoo, I live in a zoo, Anthony lives in a zoo, and we are all trying to figure out how do we get out of the zoo as much as possible. Fortunately, the doors to the zoo cages are not locked.
Right.
You know, like for many of us, they are very open, and we have only to unlock the lever or the latch and step through into a non-zoo-like environment, either by going in the ocean like we did this morning to surf, going into a as much of a wilderness area as you can, swimming in a lake or a river, spending time outside in the sunlight, trying to understand what your ancestral diet is. The door to the zoo is not locked for most people.
It's also like a reverse spiral going back to all the things that locked us into the zoo to begin with.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is generally people go, well, I can't afford to go to Costa Rica and whatever because like I need to work and I can't leave my work. It's like when you live simply and you're outside and that's what you prioritize and you actually go back towards what a human should be looking like, you actually don't need that much money. I mean, you met somebody here who was living in a spot with a couple $100 and $200-$300 a month.
In Malpais, yeah.
Yeah, it's $300 a month. I mean, you work at a cafe here for that. It's you actually don't need many resources when you strip it away and look at the fundamentals. You need some local food, some good food for sure. I think that's the biggest lever. I think that's why we both started there. You need to be outside. You need some good relationships. Like those are the things I think it all boils down to. Which like you don't need a lot of money for that. And Christopher Ryan, the book Civilized to Death, points this out a lot. Like there's this story where a tribesman stays with somebody and he leaves most of the days in like this Western world. He's like, where are you going every day? And he goes, well, I have to go away to this other place to do something for somebody else to get money that I can pay for the thing that all my family is sleeping in. He's like, what? What we do is if somebody needs a place to sleep, we just build it in a day. What do you, like, he's like, how long do you have to do that for? 30 years. He's like, what? I mean, there's this concept of like, we have to make money to pay for this cage in the zoo we're staying and the feed in the zoo and all the stuff in the zoo.
Zoo feed, yeah. I love that.
And it's sort of like freeing when you strip it away, you step outside of the cage. You go, man, I actually don't need to trade my time and get all this money and all these resources to do these things anymore.
And the last part of that anecdote from Chris Ryan is that he tells the people, you're spending all day away from the people you care about.
Right.
And I thought that was very striking too. And how many people are there on YouTube who are traveling around the world and documenting their life and paying for it with YouTube? No one listening to this can tell me, right, that you can't live this life. I mean, you have a family, I get it, you have to support your kids, but creativity is all that is needed, and a little bit of thinking outside the box. The door to the zoo cage is open for every single person listening to this. You have only to lift the latch and step through. That's a challenging thing because if you've grown up in the cage, you're used to a monkey bar here, a banana being thrown in the side door occasionally, and some ugali on the floor, right? You leave your comfortable surroundings, it's gonna feel a little funky at first, but it's out there, and I love it. It's like we humans need nature. Like our default mode is happiness and health.
Right.
And getting away from that, we are no longer like we have only to go back to a simple life or back to where we've come from, and that's why we went to Hadza. We went to visit the Hadza in our time machine because we wanted to go back and see. Oh, that's exactly true. Right. That's the default state.
And I think it's a segue to the next question that I got, which is kind of ties into how we should be living in this return to, more of a tribal lifestyle. How did they sleep? We didn't stay over there. We couldn't. So we didn't witness people sleeping. We didn't sleep with them. But we saw the huts that they slept in. They sleep on the ground. Usually a couple people to the hut. Apparently the men wake up in the middle of the night, sometimes get up, have biphasic sleep schedules. I was thinking a lot while we were here, specifically, how much our optimization of sleep in the Western world is just completely backwards. Like, we're upgrading our processed sleep, essentially, is what we're doing. I think sleep is just a normal automatic thing when you have proper sunlight, proper activity, and no distractions and no devices. Like yesterday, got up, went out, surfed, hung out,
6 a.m.
And I saw
the sunrise.
Yeah, I wake up every day at sunrise, get outside, paddle for my goddamn life, get crushed by waves for a couple hours, do that maybe a couple times a day. I'm outside the whole day, eat real food. 8 p.m. comes around and I'm wiped. And I could sleep on the floor, I could sleep anywhere, and I wake up at sunrise again. And I don't need any special mattress. I don't need any special eye mask. I don't need any white noise machine. I don't need any cool room. Like, you don't need anything. You just automatically sleep. Like, the environment will dictate the sleep for you.
When you don't have all of these.
When you don't have the zoo cage and like the need to have this schedule. And the same thing with like people with kids are like, oh, well, little Johnny needs his nap at this time. He needs his blanket here. He needs like, yeah, when you're dependent on things, you have to. But when when you're back in nature in a natural state, these things just fade away. There's actually tons of light. Our neighbor's place down here has a huge light that's shining in, and we left the curtains open a couple times. No problem. That would kill my sleep in a place like Austin. So I think you have this like threshold of like all of these things you have to manage for when you're in a city. And like the whole day is stress, like unnatural stress over and over and over again. It's problematic. But when you remove that stress, you're outside, you're in the sun all day long, you're doing physical activities, no problem.
The bucket is so much less.
Yeah, like you like sleep is one of these things where, yes, we have to optimize a lot of things in a Western world, in our environment removed from nature. But when you go back to nature, like it fixes itself. You don't have to worry about it. It's just like with happiness, you don't have to worry about it. With food choices, you don't have to worry about it. Like just have whatever nature affords you. I think that this concept it's hard for people to understand who haven't experienced it before. Like, well, aren't they tired if they wake up twice in the night? No.
They don't seem to be.
They like casually, if they have nothing to do, will maybe lay down and have a nap through the day. But it's like they don't have it's like, oh, we need to be in this position to be comfortable at night. No, it's just so basic. It's another thing you don't have to worry about.
They literally sleep on the ground.
Right.
In these thatched huts that they build in a day. And then they move somewhere else and they'll build more huts and yeah.
And I think that like if we every day were doing the same thing that they were, you would get in the groove super, super fast, and it would be something that, again, you just don't have to think about it. It's not something to manage.
Yeah. It's all just there. And like you've said, we've gone so far away from this that we have to extend intense amounts of effort to try and get back. Like the long way around, right?
Yeah.
Because we can't go back the way we came. We have to go the long way around and sort of recreate ancestral things in a technologized modern world. And how do we do that? Well, we're trying to figure it out.
It's so much energy and it's so many decisions that just fade away when you're in a place that's simple with nature.
Yeah. I want you guys to know that I saw Anthony in the surf this morning. He was out for sunrise. He's learning to surf this week, and I'm so stoked and proud of him because he's taking his licks, but he's getting it.
Oh boy,
he got crushed.
Punches in the punch card.
I saw you get crushed by a few waves today, bro. And I am not.
That's how I sleep easy.
I am not a great surfer either, but the beginning part of surfing is one of the most humbling things. I was thinking this is completely not related to this podcast, but I'll just throw it in there for bonus for you guys. If you know anyone who has learned to surf as an adult, they are a resolute, disciplined person. It is one of the hardest things ever. I am completely jealous of kids that learn to surf because they're Gumbies and they have these minds that are like, whatever, I don't care.
Yeah, we're out there with like these 10-year-olds just cutting around, no problem. Like can't paddle more than 10 feet. Brutal. Yeah, there's some days where I'm just like, screw this. I'm done. And then end of the day comes, this is our purpose. Like the Hadza have the hunting, we have surfing right now.
That's my purpose for the next month, to make good content like this with you and to give myself a little space to be creative and to get better at surfing. Hunting waves.
Takes work. Just like with hunting with Hadza, like pulling back on their bows.
Everything takes work.
You have to build that and refine that over decades to be good at it, to be able to shoot a pigeon essentially with those things. Yeah. It's insane.
Well, what did you ask my friend Tom this morning? How long have you been surfing? 15 years?
Yeah.
15 years.
I was like, oh, damn. I was like,
he's 28.
Pretty good. He's pretty good. I'm like,
he's 28.
Oh, I have, like, I can figure it out in a couple of weeks.
No. Well, because you and I both, are intermediate snowboarders, or at least I'm an intermediate snowboarder. I've been skiing for the last 15 years, but I started snowboarding again, and I'm a pretty mediocre snowboarder. And if you go to a ski mountain for a month and snowboard every day, you're going to get reasonably good by the end of the month. Not so with surfing.
Well, I mean, we were talking about this the other day in the water, but I think that snowboarding, you can choose to work at the edge of your capability. And you can just progress so much faster. When you're in the water, it's like, I can't control the size of this wave or where I am right now. I'm going to get crushed. I know it. Kind of sucks. Whereas like snowboarding, you can, heel edge all the way down the mountain if you need to. You can take this turn. You can go over there. You can
go
choose,
to the greens
you can stop.
or the blues. Yeah. And the ocean doesn't always run the chairlifts. There might not always be waves, or every chairlift goes to a black diamond because it's huge freaking waves and they're crushing you every time.
It's good. It's humbling. It's fun.
Super, super
Again,
humbling.
simple stuff.
Simple things, but it feels so good to be in the ocean. And I think I thought of that because I am watching more sunsets and sunrises than ever before
Every
here.
day.
I watch them every day. Occasionally I'll miss a sunset if I'm working with my team for Heart and Soil or whatever. But I get every sunrise and I get probably 95% of the sunsets. And for some of the sunsets, I'm in the ocean surfing. And I'm sure that's important for setting the circadian rhythms, et cetera. But that's how we're supposed to live. And that's how the Hadza are. They're always just outside at those times.
Yeah, I don't have an alarm clock on any day, and I'm waking up at 5 to 5:30 every single day.
Me too. And then I get up and I'm like, all right, I guess I'm going surfing at 5:30 in the morning.
And I'm kind of bummed because at nighttime, when I'm going to bed, usually this is my time to read. And I'm like reading for an hour or two when I'm back home in Austin or anywhere else when I'm traveling. And now I'm asleep within like 5 minutes. I'm like, God damn it, my reading time is disappearing because I'm so tired, I just go to sleep.
But you're thriving.
Right.
Like, it's a good trade-off. You mentioned something that kind of segues to one of the questions I got, which was somebody asked me, have you thought about bringing one of the Hadza tribe members back to the US or Austin to see what they think of it? And we probably will not do that. We may, right. But it's kind of already been done. You guys may know about.
I mean, how do you get them a passport and a visa? They don't
idea.
I think it would be you'd have to get some special permit for it, and it would be a comedy like the movie you're talking about.
So the movie is called "The Gods Must Be Crazy." You guys should check out this movie. It's about the Ikung in South Africa and Botswana, and it's a fictional movie with an actor who is an Ikung tribesman, a literal Ikung tribesman. And but they did create a story about a Coke bottle that gets dropped out of an airplane and how this one Coke bottle that shows up in the Ikung tribe totally throws them for a loop because they're used to nature. And in nature, there's never one of anything. There's always more of this stick or this thing to make a bow or an arrow or fletchings for the bow, for the the feathers that go on the bow to stabilize the arrow, or there's more tools to dig, or there's more baobab fruit. There's only one Coke bottle that got dropped out of this airplane. Again, it's a fictional story. That's what The Gods Must Be Crazy is all about, and how it throws this tribe for a total loop. But they took one of these actors, who's an actual Ikung tribesman, back to New York City, and they asked him at the end of that, what would you bring home? And he said, the faucet. Because he wanted to just be able to turn the faucet and have water anywhere. And of course, how's an Ikung tribesman going to understand the New York City sewer or, plumbing system, that this is actually not a magical device that just makes water. But I thought that was really interesting. And it kind of goes into the next question, which we've been asked a lot about water quality. Well,
they thought your filter was pretty magical.
They did. So I don't know.
Portable faucet.
Yeah. I don't know if they'd ever seen a water filter, although they were pretty much content to drink straight out of that stream. And so we arrived at a small stream, which was essentially a half dry riverbed, and they would dig a hole and then let it fill with water. And that was their filter. But I had an MSR backpacking filter that I brought with me to Africa, and I put in this little hole and was able to filter out the muddy water into bottles for them. And that was cool because then they could fill bottles, and I think they had some sense that it was even cleaner water.
So same thing with graded exposure and the movement and everything else. I would not suggest most Westerners to go out and drink the same water the Hadza are drinking.
No, probably not a good idea.
Yeah, you need some exposure. You need to build some resilience to that. But yeah, I mean, just the weirdest thing happened with the water is with a bunch of other things is that they just had a couple of drinks themselves when they were drinking out of the hole. We pumped a bunch of water into water bottles that were empty that we were drinking out of. And they didn't ask for them. They didn't demand them. And then when we gave them to them, then they drank them and they enjoyed them. But it wasn't like this thing where they needed water. Same thing when we brought berries back or baobab. They can go get them whenever they want. But it wasn't until you offer them that they consume the thing.
Yeah, I noticed that about the same thing with meat at the fire. There was only one instance where I saw the men, like 3 men, get kind of territorial about
a cat.
Yeah, about a piece of cat, like they were all breaking it off. But generally, they were all just sharing it and
just waiting until they were offered it.
Yeah. One of the questions I got was about hierarchy and egalitarianism. So we can maybe talk about that. So the books that I've read, the main book is by Frank Marlowe, who did his PhD with the Hadza in 1995 to 2005 or something. And he talks about there being no real hierarchy. And when we went to Hadza land, when we went to Lake Yasi, there was clearly a chief. But both Anthony and I suspect that the chief may be more of an invention of the tourism. Mm-hmm. And in the first podcast, Anthony and I talked about the pros and cons of tourism for the Hadza. One huge pro of tourism is that the reason their lands are protected is because the government has realized tourists are going to see them. We certainly had no intentions of changing their lifestyle or westernizing them in any way, shape, or form. In fact, we want to do the opposite because we see them as a window to the past. And this whole podcast has been about how we get back to living more like our ancestors have in the past and back to the sort of fundamental default mode, happiness, health, etc. But I suspect the chief is the person in the last few generations that's just become appointed to interact with Westerners. Mm-hmm. And that perhaps there's not always a chief. But other than the chief, there didn't seem to be a lot of hierarchy. The chief was the one that took the money from the guide. So our guide would pay him some money every day. Unfortunately, our guides would bring him tobacco and marijuana, which is what they like.
They love it, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. Ugali is unfortunate, but
yeah.
The ironic thing is they love these things.
Yeah, so we're bringing them something they like. We weren't the first people to do it, but the chief was the one that accepted it, and he distributed it among the tribe. Yeah. We brought them arrows. So Anthony and I went to the Datoga tribe and bought arrows made out of nails.
Arrowheads.
Arrowheads, yes, made out of nails, so the metal arrowheads. And the Hadza did have some metal arrowheads, and at least we'd read that they used some meat that they'd hunted to trade with the Datoga for the arrowheads. So we thought, oh, we'll do something nice for them. We brought them arrowheads. But they certainly do receive things, and we gave those arrowheads to the chief, quote unquote, yeah. And then he distributed them to the rest of the tribe. So it's not clear to me.
There's nothing to distribute if you're all living in nature. That's the
there's
thing
no
too.
reason.
It's like,
why do you need a chief?
Where you get resources and then have to make sure that they're distributed equally. Like you were talking about before, there's one in the Coke bottle, there's an endless amount of whatever else in nature. There's 7 arrowheads, you gotta figure out who they go to. Someone needs to make a decision. Like that is a factor of probably the exchange that they're getting now on the interface with Westerners.
Yeah, I think that it may be a function of Westernization.
So I had read the same thing separately as well.
That they didn't have.
Yeah, there was an egalitarian, they didn't have chiefs, so when we got there, I was like, yeah, that's how it is. And then Eric was like, no, there's a chief, this is the chief, I know him.
Right.
So, interesting. Again, you can't always believe what you read. You gotta see it.
Yeah, you gotta see it, and then you probably, I think when we go back, I wanna go to a separate group of Hadza and see if they're different, because there's a couple living in the area. Didn't you get a question about how many are left?
Yeah, so that's a good question. How many Hadza are left and how many were in the tribe that we saw? So I think the reports are between like 300 and 400. I don't know if there's like an official Hadza census. And how many were in the tribe that we visited? I think it was probably about 40, 50.
Yep, somewhere in that range. So
probably like, I don't know, 8 to 10 total
tribes.
Yeah. I think that the one that we were at seemed to be pretty accustomed to Westerners. I think some of them aren't. This is what Gasper was saying as well. Like he just had a relationship with this one 15 years ago and has been building that. So I think they're a little bit more used to people coming in from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Which could be good and bad.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I have no idea how we would get access to the other ones, but it'd be sort of interesting to see another one if, again, how much different is it? Are they more egalitarian? Like, do they eat tons of fiber? I doubt it because there's none there.
Are their teeth less brown? We can revisit the teeth stuff, but there's a very small amount of Hadza left, guys, which is why we thought it was cool to see them. They are an endangered species. I got one comment on my Instagram. This culture you're with, they hunt endangered species. And it really made me kind of chuckle. And I thought, you don't understand what endangered species are. The Hadza are an endangered species. I mean, not technically, obviously they're Homo sapiens, but their culture is very endangered when there's only 400 free-living hunter-gatherer Hadza left. And they really don't hunt endangered species. In fact, the Tanzania Parks and Game Reserve has forbade them to hunt elephants and some bigger game, and I believe giraffe and things like this, which have impaired their ability to get big game. So their game hunting is severely limited. We talked about this more in the first podcast. I don't think we'll go into it much in this one, but their hunting lands are encroached by pastoralist Toga and Maasai, and their ability to hunt big game is severely limited. The Hadza are an endangered species at this point, which is why it's so interesting to go see them. And there's a small amount. I think it's about the same number of San, so there might only be less than 1,000 real, quote unquote, hunter-gatherers living on this planet, and that's amongst 7 billion people,
Yeah.
Like, this is a treasure.
That's why we wanted to go now
before they're gone.
Yeah. And like, we understand that it's not like it used to be 50,000 years ago, but it's as close as we can get. It's the furthest the time machine goes back for sure.
Yeah, and I think it is pretty darn similar. And, Frank Marlowe talks about that in his book as well, that they're not a perfect representation, but they're pretty darn good. And I think this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the default mode, the natural state of humans, that with all of that sort of in context, that was a real fascination for me, is what foods does nature provide? And so in case you guys have any questions about this, based on what I observed at least, I'll let Anthony weigh in here, in the vein of what Anthony and I were talking about, of just not having to work hard at getting your food or getting your environment, and having it all work in nature, or the things that nature provides in terms of food are meat and organs, seasonal fruit, honey, and occasional tubers, which are quite fibrous, and most of it gets spit out. So that's what I find quite fascinating. And that's really why we're doing what we're doing.
And I'll always point out that that's specific to where we saw in Africa.
Yes.
So humans have flourished other places. I know you have a paper on the blue zone. Here we are in Costa Rica.
Yes.
There's like a lot of stuff around that, but there, I'm sure, are other cultures that can thrive on different ratios of fruit to meat, etc.
Yes.
And so while it's tempting, I think, to say like, okay, Hadza ate this way. We saw it with our own eyes. Therefore, all 7 billion current living humans should eat that way. I think there's some flexibility there for sure.
There is flexibility. I do wonder, I imagine, based on my understanding of human evolution, where we come from, that the Hadza are sort of the last fiber that links back to the old Homo sapiens, or the original Homo sapiens. And people have called the Hadza that the last living direct descendants of Homo sapiens. That is the region. We were in the region of the Rift Valley of East Africa, where Homo sapiens are, well, essentially Australopithecines, and then Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Paranthropus, eventually becoming Homo sapiens, are believed to have originated. And if you look at the fossil record, it looks like Homo sapiens left Africa 70 to 60,000 years ago. So, but remarkably, having been there, it's amazing how much food there is, right? Yeah. There's baobab, there are berries, there's honey, there used to be game. It's like, wow, this is a great place to live.
It's abundant.
I can imagine being here in Costa Rica would be almost the same at this latitude. We're at 10 north latitude here in Santa Teresa, and you can imagine there were monkeys, and there probably were big game here in Central America, probably. There's a lot of fruit. Mangoes grow on trees seasonally. And so this is fascinating that these are the foods I think that humans started with, and then we sort of branched off and were able to do more things. Now, this is an aside. We don't have to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I was talking with Tom, my friend, in the waves the other morning, and I think that within our culture right now, within our society of medicine and health, it's very in vogue to get your, quote, genetics checked, and to understand what is your optimal diet based on your genetics. And I actually think that's kind of bullshit, because our genetics, it's all polygenetic. It's not just one gene that's going to tell you need more fiber, less fiber, black beans, whatever. But Tom had this idea that what if it's all based on the latitude where you actually are?
Yeah, we talked about this a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Because being in Costa Rica, I find myself wanting to eat things a little bit different than I did when I lived in Seattle.
Right.
Like tropical fruit, and maybe this is just my subjective experience. Maybe it's completely unscientific, but I'm in a place with this much sun and warmth. It just feels right to eat papaya and mango,
100%.
the kind of foods that grow here, a little bit less fat because I'm doing more carbohydrates, right? I'm going to eat honey because honey is something that's tropical region. There's definitely honey to be found at this latitude. And I'm going to eat meat, but it's going to be a little leaner and a little less fat. So that's what my diet is right now. It's a little higher carbohydrate, maybe 100 to 150 grams a day of carbs, maybe more sometimes. And then meat and fat and organs, or desiccated organ supplements. And that's it. I think it changes. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with your genetics.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the way I always sort of push back and think about this is that okay, we left Africa 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago. Our genetics changed in a very obvious way when we left beholden to our environment. So our skin color changed.
Right.
And our skin color changed all over the place. What changed on the inside?
Right.
What changed in response to food? And obviously skin is just one thing, but I mean, when I come to Costa Rica, I get a little bit more tan, but it's not like I look like a native Costa Rican. Somebody who's like been like in Central America and their genetics have evolved here for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And so what is not changing from like what foods are available and what you can eat? So I always think of like, I mean, even when we were in Africa, I remember I was eating the fruit and I was like, man, my blood sugar is actually regulating way better eating more fruit now in an area where it's like abundant and local. And then I went to Miami and like, even though it was still sunny there, the food wasn't local. And I think that, yes, it has something to do with where you're at if you're eating local food, like the food that was actually grown there.
Or that would grow there.
Right, which is tricky in places like the US where you go to a grocery store and go, oh, well, my genetics are at this spot and I'm at this spot, but you're getting food shipped from across the world, even if it's at the same latitude. It's like, there's a problem there. Like, I think that we'll end up understanding this in probably hundreds of years, that there's something in the food that gives you a local, like, it gives you messages about the environment. It's like DNA communicator or something. I don't know. We'll see. But there has to be something about the locality of food. I feel so much better in just eating the local food, even if it's the same type of food, than in Miami. Again, like, it tasted terrible. I was like, what is this? I had some like, weird disconnect in my brain. What is this? Like, what am I eating? My blood sugar felt erratic. I felt like my energy was going all over the place eating fruit there, which is my experience in Austin, versus here, I feel totally fine. In Africa, I felt totally fine. That's weird.
Well, Austin's an interesting place because you and I both, quote, live there now. And there's not a lot of what kind of seasonal fruit would we get in Austin? Prickly pear cactus, which is horrible. Have you ever tried to eat it?
Well, I mean, this is like, then we're going to rabbit hole of what's actually native versus what can grow there.
Yeah.
That's a whole other can of worms. Like me getting into farming, it's like I want to get fruit and nut trees and put them where we run the cattle and the chickens to have more integrated ecosystem. But like, what are we taking from other places and putting here that's actually an artificial thing? Like,
right.
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of citrus there. A lot of citrus.
Normally.
Yep.
Yeah. There's always animals. There's animals everywhere.
Yeah.
There's animals everywhere. I mean, that goes kind of back to the carnivore thing, or at least the animal-based thing. I think that I suspect, and again, this is just my suspicion, and there are isotopic analyses of Homo sapiens living in Northern Europe from 50,000 years ago, and their delta-15 nitrogen was quite high, suggesting they were still eating a lot of animals. So I think that wherever humans, or the hypothesis that I would suggest is that wherever humans went, they always tried to eat as many animals as possible.
Until they ate too many.
Until they ate too many, which is actually an interesting paper that my friend Miki Ben-Dor just sent me. Maybe I can get him back on the podcast.
Was it the one that they just published?
Yeah. He just published a paper. I'll just mention the title, and then maybe I'll get Mickey back on the podcast.
It is in depth and it is awesome.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So this is the one I believe, and it's prey size decline as a unifying ecological selecting agent in human evolution. Are you thinking of another one?
Yeah, his recent one about the change from Pleistocene.
This is it. We hypothesized that megafauna extinctions throughout the Pleistocene that led to a progressive decline in large prey availability were a primary selecting agent in key evolutionary and cultural changes in prehistory. So basically what Mickey is saying in this paper is that the megafauna extinction during the Pleistocene, which is 2.6 million to 11,000 years ago, he's postulated in previous papers that extinction was at least in part driven by humans, perhaps also driven by meteor impacts, the Younger Dryas, etc. But he is at least hypothesizing in this paper that as the animals became less large and the megafauna was smaller, or the megafauna was less prevalent, that humans had to adapt to that, and that may have driven certain changes in our brain that adapted us to hunting smaller animals. So it's an interesting take on the whole thing. But yeah, we certainly, I think that wherever we went as humans...
Yeah, the one I have is the evolution of the human trophic level during the Pleistocene.
Right, okay.
Yeah, this one. Yeah.
What did he talk about in this one?
Oh man, it is so in depth. It's 30 pages long of just it's basically the one you were just talking about is like one piece, like one argument.
Okay.
Of like basically how we've assimilated energy and then how it changed the evolution. It's awesome.
Interesting. And I will tell my favorite story of human evolution, which is the story of Paranthropus. I've told this on the podcast before, but if you guys don't know, you can refer back to that. There was essentially Australopithecus diverged into two different species, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, which are Homo ergaster, however you want to call it, and then the second species, which is Paranthropus boisei. And if you look at the stable isotope analysis, Paranthropus ended up being more of a plant eater and went extinct. So this is, of course, 2 to 3 million years ago, before the sort of Homo sapiens migration out of Africa. But it is interesting to note that within anthropology, it's not really debated that it was the animal-eating branch of human evolution that persisted, that changes were happening, that something about our environment. Obviously, we came from primates that were eating more plants, or a lot of plants, and something about our human environment really selected for us to eat more meat. And as I've hypothesized, and many others have as well, that the eating of meat and the special unique nutrients in meat drove the gain in brain size and was the key factor there. Some people would suggest it was fire, but fire didn't come along until much later, 1.5 million years after our brains started to expand.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and thinking about the behavior of humans, and we've been chatting a lot about like what led to agriculture, what led to a lot of our problems, and just keep peeling about it. You know, like was it the actual behavior that we have, like this selfish gene in humans, and this intelligence that allowed us to outsmart animals? It's like, okay, we split into these two branches. You have to be pretty smart to outsmart a lot of nature and catch them and kill them consistently. And then once you had these nutrients, you ate them, that led to more of that. You had this positive feedback loop. Then you overhunted. Then we're like, oh shit, we need to like outsmart our environment even more. Okay, let's grow a bunch of stuff and then feed more people. And then like, now we're like, we keep trying to outsmart our environment by making new technologies and it keeps screwing us. Just like we overhunted and screwed us. We made agriculture, it screwed us. Now we're making all these technologies, social media, it's screwing us. And so I think like, this will be the story of Homo sapiens. I think it's just like trying to be smarter than nature in our environment.
Too smart for our own good.
And like allowing new technologies to have us have new inventions, and that actually screwing us more and more and more. Yeah, so it's super interesting.
But I mean, I think that there's an interesting point here, which is if we realize that trend, and I think that's a very astute observation, then I think we have to raise our hand and say, wait, is it time to go back? Is it time to go, how do we become less technologized? How do we go back to hunting everything? How do we get back out of agriculture? Because if we keep making technologies and they keep breaking our environments, then I think we have to raise our hand and go, whoa, 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 whoa. Maybe we should stop. Maybe we should actually stop making these technologies that are breaking our environments and figure out how to become a little more primitive, quote unquote.
Fake meat. You get technologists, idiots like Bill Gates saying, oh, we have to go this way. And they, use virtue signaling and caring about the ethics of animals and not killing them, as well as the environment, which is obviously misguided. We can talk about that as much as we would like. But making lab-grown meat is not the answer.
No.
Taking a cell culture from an animal, like talk about refinement. This is how, here it is. We've refined sugar, we've refined grains, we've refined oils. We haven't refined animal products until now.
Now we're going to refine it.
We're gonna figure out how to refine animal products.
And it's going to be 20 years.
Has it ever been good for us before at any other food choice? We haven't been able to. It's our only source of real food left, basically. And now we're going to refine it.
In case you guys have wondered, I was going to do a controversial thoughts about this synthetic lab-grown meat. My thoughts are that it's a horrible idea and that they're going to fuck it up. And there's going to be absolutely all sorts of problems, and it's going to be so refined. It's not going to have the right cofactors and balance and peptides. And it's going to be a genetic nightmare, nutritional nightmare for humans. But you want to move on to hygiene? I think people will be curious about this because this was something that we noticed juxtaposed between our urban guides and the Hadza. I think one of the more interesting questions I got was, do the Hadza smell? And I didn't smell the Hadza at all. And I actually found myself, people are going to laugh at this, kind of like trying to sniff them a little bit. I know, I was like trying to sniff them. Like I'm standing like 6 inches behind these guys. They're our friends. And I was like, like trying to do the little Bugs Bunny, like, you got any smell? No, they don't even smell at all, dude. And their breath didn't smell either. You mentioned that. I didn't even think about that. But their breath.
It looks like it would.
It looks like it would, and we can talk about the teeth. But their breath didn't smell. They didn't smell. But our guides, you could smell them.
Yep. The guides who went to the urban areas and ate more
garbage.
I was going to say saturated fat and less fiber, but no, yeah. And we saw them eating ugali and opting for this stuff when we went to go eat barbecue and things like that, and the vegetable oil, and living in cities, breathing in these fumes. One of the things I noticed as well around a lot of the areas in Africa driving around, I was like, oh, this is why we have emissions tests in the U.S. This is why I get annoyed every 2 years when I have to go get my car tested.
Because the emissions were so bad.
It's brutal. You don't have any regulations on that stuff. Like, I was in one of the questions that's up next is, did you ever fear for your life? Like, yeah, breathing these emissions. Like, am I going to be choked out and die? So like, who knows like what happens in your body and what you excrete when you breathe this stuff in a city where you have no environmental regulations at all. So yeah, I mean, just the urbanized folk that we were with, 100%. When I was within 10 feet of one of these guys, I was like trying to distance myself because he smelled so bad.
I am fascinated by human smells. Anyone that's listened to my podcast. Well, I mean, I've been fascinated by human smells since I was a kid, right? Farts are the coolest thing ever. They're hilarious. But in the last, I have not used deodorant for over a year at this point, and I smell like a human. Like, I have a smell, but I don't think it's very strong. And I was fascinated by the Hadza smell.
Have you noticed a change between Austin, Africa, Costa Rica?
It's so subtle because I live with it every day, right? If there was somebody with me all the time that was like, oh, your smell has changed, I think maybe it's less intense. I don't think it smells that strongly.
I don't think I've gotten close enough to you.
No, you could do some research. You'd be like, oh, Anthony, smell my fist.
Sampling.
Smell my fist today. But I'll tell you guys something interesting that's vulnerable. This is not something I've ever shared in a podcast, but it's fascinating. I've heard this anecdote that when Napoleon was on his crusades, they're not really crusades, but when Napoleon was like ransacking Europe, he wrote back to Josephine and said, don't bathe for a week before I get home, because he wanted to smell her. And of course, humans have pheromones, right? Like, we're supposed to smell each other. When I am dating a woman, I don't like the smell of deodorant. I actually ask women that I date to not wear deodorant.
Are they living a life where they don't have any stench, or you just want to see what's under there because you're fascinated?
I think that I'm fascinated. I mean, they've done experiments like this, right? Where both with birth control and other things, like, there are pheromones for both men and women. Women can pick out their men's smell. And I think that there's birth control can abrogate their ability to do that, or birth control can change this, or women's smell changes throughout the month. Obviously, the pheromones change, and if you're on birth control, you're not going to have an ovulatory cycle that's going to cause a fertility period, and the smell is going to change, the pheromones are going to change. And so I think that I just want, when I'm dating a woman, I want to smell them unencumbered, because I want the pheromones to know if this is a match. I want to know from being with this woman, like, what is my body saying at a subconscious level?
So when you're on like dating apps, you guys match and you say, hey, it's a little weird, we can't meet for a week. And you can't shower.
And you can't wear deodorant.
Don't wear deodorant. Don't shower for a week, and then we'll see you for the first date.
That's what you've been doing? No wonder I have such a hard time getting dates.
Well, I think it'll be a good filter for the right one.
Yeah, it'll be a good filter for the right one. But I think it's fascinating that usually what happens is I'll date a woman for a few weeks or months, and I'll say, hey, what do you think about this? And they don't know what's coming, right? Am I going to talk about some weird sex thing? And I'm like, actually, how about you just don't wear deodorant for a week? And they look at me funny, like, what? I thought you were going to ask me some kinky sex thing or something, And it's like, no, I just want you to not wear deodorant. And sometimes they're okay with it, and sometimes they're not.
Now you can just send them this podcast ahead of time, so you don't have to bring it up, and then the seeds planted in their head. Yeah, good to go.
And women who will know, like, if I want to match with Carnivore MD, whose real name is Paul, I have to be willing to go deodorant.
Is that your profile name when you're dating apps?
Yeah, I put the Carnivore MD in my dating. No, I don't put that at all. That's a whole separate podcast.
Do you put that you're carnivore on your profile?
No. Although on my...
Because it's like one of these things where they're probably like, oh, shit, like, what am I getting myself into when you finally have to tell them about the whole thing?
Yeah.
I mean, you're less crazy than you were a couple years ago when we first met.
Yeah.
Like, you're eating fruit and honey and this stuff. Like, so what is the profile?
I mean, this is the full disclosure. So, like, I had a dating profile. I still have a dating profile on Hinge. In Austin, that's the only one I have. And I put on there that the woman must like steak, fun, and adventure in that order. And I get matches from women sometimes who are like, I don't like steak. How's 2 out of 3? And I immediately unmatch them.
It's a great filtering mechanism.
I say, and I don't mean to be mean. I'm like, I know that if you don't like steak, we're not going to get along because I don't want to get into the full vegetarian vegan conversation. And sometimes I do with them, but it's a long rabbit hole. So yeah, I mean, I would hope that I could meet people organically, but it's challenging today's day and age.
Oh yeah. So are your photos like you shirtless, you with no clothes, and like have a ribeye instead of a cloth loin?
A ribeye loincloth? Well, I will admit there is a shirtless photo on my profile, but I think it's after surfing. So I wanted to like not be a complete.
You always have to have the unstaged shirtless photo.
Yeah, I wanted an unstaged shirtless photo because truth in advertising. And I mean, I'm a healthy individual that has a six pack. Like, women appreciate this. Anyway, where did this conversation go? Let's talk a little bit about what we know about Hadza sexuality. And then that's about all. Then we'll maybe see where we go from there. Okay. So people asked questions about marriage and sexuality. They do marry. They are monogamous, which is interesting because there are certain tribes. We mentioned Chris Ryan. He obviously wrote another book called Sex at Dawn, which is about polyamory and bonobos and chimps and how there are many tribes throughout the world who are not monogamous, but the Hadza are monogamous. They seem to be fairly happy with that. Mating success is based on hunting success, but I think most of the men become good enough hunters because they get those 10,000 hours in pretty quickly. There were not any, I don't know. I mean, we didn't actually spend enough time to know if there were unpaired males there, but most of the men seem to have a wife at some point. And I think that after menopause, the men choose a new wife. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I've read that.
Frank's book say that?
Yeah, Frank Marlowe. That a man will choose a new wife after the woman goes through menopause. And then to that point, we did not ask them about menopause, but I have read that their menopausal symptoms are very mild, which goes back to everything else we're talking about. Is it the xenoestrogens? Is it the environmental toxicants? Is it all these things we're eating in our diet that are worsening menopause for women? I suspect it is. Mm-hmm. I've done a podcast with Jamie Seaman where I talked about menopause. Guys, if you want to go back and find that one. But I think that the more you can get back to living in natural default mode way, menopause will be better for women as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is just also goes back to the observation I was making in Miami after like being in Africa for a while and being back in an American city. I was not a fan. I'm generally not a fan of American cities. I think they're crazy and people there were intense. Values are very different than they were other places in the world, especially like where we are right now, where it's like value being outside and having healthy food. Just because something's common does not mean it's normal. And I think the same thing with what you're talking about with menopause. It's like we've normalized something because it's common. The symptoms are common, therefore people expect it to happen. And anything deviating from that is now some weird outlier that isn't real, it's not reality, because what we live in with the Western world is common. I mean, this is the same thing with most chronic disease. It's common to be overweight or have diabetes or have heart disease or die from a heart attack or cancer. Just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal. We shouldn't expect that. We have to ask, like, why is this the case? Like, is it possible to not suffer from all of these things, including menopause? And I think the answer is yes. But it's common, so therefore we expect it to be normal.
And we're taught that it's normal in medical school.
Mm-hmm.
You were taught that, I imagine. I was taught that in medical school. Hypertension is normal as you age. For every decade, systolic blood pressure goes up, except in the Hadza, except in free-living humans in which there's no such thing as hypertension as you age. There's no such thing as age-related hypertension. So, I mean, within medical science, there is primary hypertension and secondary hypertension. And primary hypertension is hypertension due to aging, quote unquote. Oh, this is essential hypertension. It's just your genetics. It's as you're aging. Bullshit. And I love that. Just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal for humans. So, and we should not accept diabetes as normal. Alopecia areata, alopecia, androgenic alopecia is normal, or eczema or psoriasis or acne. I've been thinking a lot about skin stuff recently and how much skin issues are tied to our diet.
Yeah.
And, we didn't see any acne there. They had amazing skin. We didn't see anybody with eczema or psoriasis. We didn't see anybody with any clear vitiligo or anything like that. I mean, Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot there were no chronic diseases that were common in the Hadza.
Yep, obesity.
None. I mean, one woman who apparently had spent a lot of time with the missionaries in the city looked a little more obese.
Maybe she's overweight, but probably not obese.
Yeah.
Or it's like in a culture of the U.S. now where, because it's common, we've normalized it, and now there's this body positivity movement, which I think people should be happy in their bodies and be on a journey if they're overweight or obese, but it doesn't make it normal for a human to exhibit that. If I were to watch the monkeys in the tree and there's all these monkeys that look the same, and there's one that's 3 times the size of the other monkey, I would say, what the hell happened to this monkey? Like, what is wrong with that monkey? And because now we live in a society where 9 of those 10 monkeys, or 7 out of those 10, or whatever the stat is, are that large, and you go, oh wow, what's wrong with the weird small ones?
Or the small ones shouldn't make fun of the big one. You know, the small ones.
It's not making fun. Like,
the small ones.
No need to make fun. Like,
the small ones can't say to the big ones, "Why are you so big?"
Yeah, like, to be able to support people and say, "Hey, this is an issue." Like, it's just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal or healthy.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one to broach without getting canceled. But
yeah, I chose my words poorly there. I didn't mean make fun. I just meant that basically the Cosmo cover, you know.
Oh yeah.
Like the idea that Cosmopolitan was promoting this, you know, love your body image. It's okay to be obese, and it's like, look, great, be comfortable in your skin, and
look, it is okay. It is okay if that's your choice.
Yeah,
it's not healthy.
It's not healthy. Which
is what they say verbatim. This is healthy in the cover. It's not
exactly. It's not, and that's been shown in multiple studies that if you are obese, and this makes sense evolutionarily, like if you are obese, you are putting more stress on your body. That is not a healthy state to be.
In many ways.
Maybe it's a mentally healthy state and you can love your body for wherever it is, and people arrive at that state in a lot of different ways because of incorrect education or difficulty in their life or stress or whatever. That's fine. We understand that. But it's not doing the optimal things for your body's physiology. Right. You have to just be very clear about that and be able to say that in response to the Cosmo cover. Like, that's not going to lead to optimal human health.
It's common for the state we're in 2021 in the Western world. It is not normal for a human organism.
No, it's not.
Because it's not normal for any organism.
We don't see those types of body patterns among free-living wild humans.
I will say it is normal for some organisms that hibernate throughout the winter.
Interesting.
But not normal for humans because they don't do that.
Yeah.
So I'll correct before somebody corrects me.
Like a bear or something that gets fat.
Walrus. There's like, obviously that's more of a temperature thing to stay warm, but in general, for mammals, abnormal.
Or at least for hominids.
100%.
Yeah.
Cool. Off track again. So let's get back to the questions.
So we talked a little bit about the women. I got a few questions about the women. Like, you guys didn't have any pictures of the women or videos with the women. I did post a video on my Instagram about us digging tubers with the women.
I did a whole post on my Instagram, it's on my profile, about women and children with a bunch of different points of what I observed. So check that out if you're interested there. But what are some of the questions you got about?
Just, do they hunt with the men? The answer is generally no. They do associate with the men, and when they go dig for tubers, the men may accompany and just kind of hang out and say hi, and the men might grab some sticks for bows or arrows, or the men might look for some honey, but the women are going to go dig tubers. Do they marry? Yes, they marry. We talked about monogamy. Is there abuse? I think it happens occasionally. There's always humans that get jealous, but generally it's not common. There's really not a lot of violence that we saw, but it's not something that's unheard of, at least in the papers that I've written.
And I want to make it clear, like, it's not that we're not interested in women. I actually, like, made a point to one day spend time with them. It's that there are, like we said in the first podcast, clear division of genders.
Yes.
And so we got there, all the men came around us like, hey, come hang out with us. And they separated throughout the entire day. So generally speaking, we went and did the stuff with the men because all the men always hang out, and that's just the way it was. So it's not like we were intentionally avoiding because we found women less interesting. I mean, I don't even think that's a point I need to make, but you need to be careful of that. Like, I think it can be construed that way. And like, it is a very separate culture. And I found that very interesting, that even at nighttime, like basically until they about go to bed, they're apart from each other all day long. They seem to enjoy that. It seems to work out pretty well for them.
Yeah. And then they imagine they go, when it gets dark or after we leave camp, they go together and they spend time in huts. And that's presumably when they have sex. So we don't know much about the sexuality because we couldn't ask about it. I only know the sexuality based on what I've read. We talked about the monogamy. I don't know how often they have sex. I don't know any of these things.
I got asked like many times if they masturbate. I have no idea.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I will mention here a sad thing about the Hadza that I've read that we did not ask them about, but historically they do practice clitoral sort of circumcision, which is the euphemistic way of saying clitoral sort of, I don't even know, like, what am I looking for here? Basically clitoral, let's just say clitoral circumcision in women where they cut off the head of the clitoris.
Do you know what age?
I think it's maybe somewhere around puberty or something. I'm not sure. But what I read in Frank Marlowe's book was that when asked about this, they said if they don't do that, the women will enjoy sex too much. So this is not a utopian society. This is practiced in a lot of African tribes. They have this sort of clitoral mutilation is what I was looking for, where they will cut off the head of the clitoris. And so it's hard to say. I mean, I can hypothesize, but it's one of these things. You're like, that sucks, you know? But
yeah, I mean, there's more things like that. We also noticed, I think on some of my photos, if you go to my Instagram page and see some like the profile shots I got, there's two lines, these vertical lines on the cheeks. And we asked, it was like, what? Because only like 50-60% of people have these.
Yeah.
I mean, they're prominent in adults, children, everything. Like, what is this? And apparently they cut the cheeks of the children who cry a lot. And this is something it's unclear to me whether it was learned to be a defense when times were a little bit more dangerous, when they had predators, other tribes, etc., because they didn't want the children to cry to give away the spot or attract predators. Now I don't think that's the case. So I don't know if it's just a cultural thing that's stuck along since then. But this is another thing. Like, we don't mean to romanticize these people to say like everything they do is incredible and all humans have to live exactly how they live. It's like we're trying to learn and observe as much as we can. And I think no matter where you go, you're going to find something that's like, oh, that's a little strange. I guess I wouldn't prefer that. That's maybe a little weird. And this is one of those things. It's like, I think there's a lot to learn, but to romanticize every single thing to do, I don't think is appropriate either.
I think they also circumcise the males, and they do it when they are in their early teens. And I think we heard from Eric that they're not allowed to make a sound when they are cutting off the young.
It's like a rite of passage, or
yeah, I think maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you get some of these things that are apparent and emergent in separate cultures, and I wonder like why that emerged here. And the same thing with the crying. Like, this is why I don't think humans are weird or twisted. I think that it's generally like there's a reason for the emergence of the behavior. And the same thing with what happened when women were more promiscuous or had more sexual desires. What happened? Like, what was the corrective behavior for? Like, why? It's like, I understand like the tradition for Western societies to circumcise is due to infection, which like makes sense in a more natural environment where you're exposed to things and people in cities and all this type of stuff. Like, I totally get that, but it doesn't make sense for me from that sort of origin of circumcision in the Hadza, why they would practice that, unless it's like a tough male thing that sort of happened. And these things are just like, it's so hard when you have places like this where they have no written history. After a generation or two, you don't know why you do anything anymore other than the stories that are being told. So you can't get answers. Like, you can hypothesize if you can't get answers.
It's difficult. And that's something else to note. The Hadza they don't read. They have no written language. They have no need for it. They certainly do educate the children, but it's mostly education about the environment. Their school is they're not in a cage. They don't have a reason to have words and letters and stories.
Yeah. I mean, a question I got frequently, and one was, is there a formal education? Do they learn to read and write? And I don't know if formal is a way, but again, like, how natural is formal education?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, this time, this day, for this many years, if you're this age, you learn these things. That's weird, isn't it?
It's not. That's not normal at all. You know.
But yeah, I mean, about the writing, they don't need to learn to write or read because they literally have no need for it. There's just no, like, and you made a good point when we were chatting about this earlier. Like, they're not stupid.
They're not.
They're really smart. And we've tied literacy to intelligence so tightly for so many years that it's almost like, oh, we're depriving somebody if they're not learning to read and write, because we extrapolate to maybe developing countries where they're dependent on the Western world but don't know how to read or write, so therefore they're behind comparatively to maybe some kid in Asia or America or wherever. That's just not the case. Like we're comparing apples to oranges here. They're very different things. They learn so much about their environment, and I think that's totally appropriate for how they live. An American going, well-educated teenage kid who scores 1,600 on their SATs would go and probably die if they were left out in the same environment.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's like, what?
Certainly die. Yeah.
Like, what's better? What's a better way to teach here?
Well, it's relative, right? Like, what do you learn? It's relative to your environment. And I know very little about the education system, but I have heard murmurings and seen a little bit in the small amount that I've investigated that perhaps the school system was built to prepare people for factory work. And that then, going to school at 8 a.m. and getting out at 3 o'clock and these bells and you're sitting in one spot in a classroom and you're learning. It's like there is some suggestion that historically that was a model developed to prepare humans for the zoo.
Yeah.
To prepare humans to be good participants in factories, which start work at 8 and leave at 5 and have a lunch break, and you sit in a computer or at a line or a typist, or you do things in factories. You are a good worker. And that's interesting because the Hadza are not that. They get up with the sun, they get out, they play, the kids are free to roam. So we haven't talked about the kids much, but I was fascinated by the children. I mean, we talked about this in the first podcast, they were free to roam. They were free to experience risk and hurt and pain and learn on their own. And they're not necessarily watching to make sure the kid doesn't wander out of the camp. I mean, right? I mean, they would let kids like move around camp, 2 or 3 year old kids. There was a 1-year-old child walking around, just cruising around, and they might keep an eye on him, but that child could just walk right out of camp and they just know, like, this is where my parents are. I'm not going to go far away. And they learn in a fascinating way. And what we didn't hear was a lot of crying. We didn't hear a lot of whining. The kids were very well behaved.
Oh, yeah.
It was very interesting to me. They were very well behaved. I mean, if you got that many kids in any one spot in the US crying and stealing of toys, and the kids would just come to the fire. They were curious. They want to know what's going on. We'd share food with them.
Interestingly, the kids here are also very well behaved and amazing. And the same thing here.
In Costa Rica.
Same thing here as with the Hadza, the dogs. Obviously no leashes with the Hadza. Dogs were extremely well behaved. There are tons of dogs and tons of children here. Again, so I'm sort of like calling it parallels because like everyone here is outside all the time. Kids are amazing. Dogs are amazing. All off leash for the dogs. Kids seem to be just totally happy in their environment, stumbling around the sand and the water. Again, just like back into nature, a lot of things could sort of solve themselves. Instead of like trying to be like, oh, well, you need to raise your kid this way and use this discipline thing, give them this feedback and have this toy and have this routine, and or just put them outside. Like, obviously I'm simplifying it. I don't have kids, so I don't want me to offend any parents out there. But yeah, I mean, it's just, even schools that existed before what Paul was saying regarding the factories, like this is something that I've heard as well regarding my time in formalized schools, like very reminiscent of a factory. Mm-hmm. But before that, we still obviously examples of school, but it was far more apprenticeship focused, which is what I think we saw a lot of different times. Kids would go they would learn, they would like probably find something they're really good at. We had some musicians in the group. We had people who were better hunters.
One guy who was an orator, like the guy who sang, and he was also a musician.
Yeah. So like I'm sure at some point, like an elder takes and educates along with and does a lot of apprenticeship, just like you would do if you were painting or a blacksmith many, many years ago. Whereas like we've lost that way to learn. It's like, oh, here's how you do something over many years, decades. So, like, of course, they don't have books, but they don't need them.
I talked about this in my Instagram, and probably on the last podcast. There was a 10-year-old kid that came with us when we were looking for honey on the last day. And while the, sort of senior member of the group I was with, so the chief was with us, but there was a much more elderly gentleman with us who was very vital. And they found a tree, and we found a hive at the bottom of this canoa, this stingless bee honey. And the guy immediately went into the woods, chopped off a branch, made it into pegs, hammered those into the tree, and climbed this baobab tree. And he was 35 feet up in the air before I even knew it. And at the same time, the 10-year-old, as he was waiting on the ground, he didn't climb up with the adults, was with us, and he had a knife, and he was making the pegs as a trial. So he was apprenticing, like, oh, I'm going to be that guy, or I want to be the guy that carries the axe and climbs the trees for the honey. I'm going to practice making these pegs. And, the other guy looked at him and probably gave him some feedback. And was like, no, do this better. And it was cool. There was definitely apprenticeship going on for how to freaking live in the wild.
Which is also how I've been surfing. It was like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Just paddling around, getting smashed, watching other people oh, we should get up. Paul is like, no, do this, dummy. There's a lot of that. I think that's where humans learn the best, is learn by doing and by looking at other people, how they're doing it, and getting instruction hand in hand. And that's how they do all of their education there, very clearly. There's no formal now year 4, it's time to learn how to make a bow. So lesson 1 is you have to learn about the biology of trees. And so we're going to go learn why we're using this acacia branch because it's bendable. No, you learn over a period of time. There's no structured learning. It's learning by doing.
And learning out of necessity in the environment.
Totally.
You got any more questions you want to? I think we've covered most of mine.
Yeah, I think a couple quick ones around nutrition. Do they consume or have access to dairy? Answer is no, because they hunt wild animals. They probably could trade with the Datoga, but from what I understand, they do not do that. When you're living in Africa, there's no... the Datoga milk the cows and they drink it immediately. There's no keeping the raw dairy. Were eggs a thing for them? No. I don't know if Frank put in the book if they find them ever, if they eat them. Or...
We talked to Eric about there's one type of bird that makes its nest in a tree, and the female goes in the tree, and the male fortifies the female in a tree and feeds the female through a hole with the eggs. And when they find that bird, they will open the nest and eat the female and the eggs. But it's only certain times of the year. So I think eggs are pretty rare for them.
Yeah. Okay. If they hunted bigger game, which we talked about the last episode a lot, and then touch on it this one, why they can't, and that's why we hunted baboons, a much smaller game. What do they do to preserve the meat? They have huge feasts and celebrations for it, eat as much as they can, and then they basically cut it into small slices and then hang it on the trees and dry it out like jerky is what my understanding is.
Yeah, that's what I've read. We didn't see it. They would have to get a very large animal for that to happen. So if they got an impala, if they got an eland, which is 1,000 kilograms, they would probably have meat to preserve. But if they're only getting an animal that's a few hundred pounds, they're going to eat it within a few days. It's going to be gone.
Yeah, the question is if they had access to giraffes, elephants often, would the tribe be bigger than 40 people? Probably.
Maybe.
And so the kill would only be enough for what they needed, and they have maybe Dunbar's number. I wonder if there's any association with that around how much an elephant can feed, how much a giraffe can feed. That's kind of an interesting thing. Maybe that's the cap of how much a large game can feed in one sitting.
150. Yeah, you can imagine 150 people could probably go to town on an elephant buffet.
Yeah. And that's just what would have happened.
Yeah, when you had megafauna and you could get a hippo or a rhino, which would be incredible they're endangered. Nobody's hunting rhinos, but can you imagine eating a rhino? That would be gnarly. Megafauna like a woolly mammoth or a bigger game animal. Yeah. Start to 150 people is a lot of people to feed, a lot of mouths to feed.
Yep. So that kind of ties into the previous question around how many were there. We answered that. Did they take any vaccines or accept any Western medicine? Not that I'm aware of.
I do not think they do that at all.
Yeah, period.
They did use plants in the surrounding environment for medicine. That was a question I got.
Yeah, I got the root tea and chewed on the root.
Yep, it was rare. And we asked them, what do you do when you get sick? And they said, we make a tea or we boil some roots. And I don't know if that's the one plant or if they're multiple plants. We'd have to go back, but they do use some.
From what I understand from Gasper, he said that they have a lot of plants that they use. And we talked about this a lot in the past of plants to be used as medicine primarily.
Right, rather than
exactly
food.
It's exactly what they did.
Yes. And they did use plants as medicine. And of course, I've talked about this, that many of the medications that we use in Western medicine are derived from plants. I've never debated the fact that plants contain bioactive molecules in humans. If you guys are familiar with my work specifically, the contention that I've advanced is just the notion that those molecules are indispensable or somehow make us better than we could be eating mostly animal foods.
Or the pharmaceuticals are just more refined versions of the plant that has the thing in it. It's another, what we were talking about before.
Exactly.
Maybe it's actually totally fine to have some of these things in a whole plant form, and then when you refine it, you have all these weird side effects and problems.
Yeah, and the other thing is I've mentioned multiple times is that just like we see pharmaceuticals with side effects, we can't ignore the fact that many of these plant molecules have documented side effects as well. And so probably, at least from my perspective, we should be careful using them every day as food.
Right, but medicine. Yeah, this is clearly not what they were doing. Like my stomach started turning after we ate these berries. I don't know if we talked about this in the last podcast or not, but
we did.
Yeah, we dug up. They're like, oh, no. Okay, dig up this root. No one was digging up these roots to eat them.
No.
And they were bitter.
They were not
rough.
They were not food.
Yeah. We stabbed into a tree to get sap that's for mosquito bites and itching.
Yeah.
Which actually smelled really good. Like I would love to bottle that stuff up. It was amazing. Another question I got about kind of tie in this type of stuff is toothbrush. Do they have any like oral hygiene? Yes, Gorgio showed me. I don't think you saw this. Like when we were walking back from the hunt, it's like, hey, this is a toothbrush. Like you chew on the end, and it got really fibrous. And then he said they use that. He said, I asked how often. He's like, whenever they feel like it. So I don't know when that is. And I know you wanted to talk about teeth one more time. But again, straight dentition, strong teeth. No one was missing teeth, but really brown from a couple of different factors.
In some of them.
Yeah.
Not in 100%, which was baffling for me.
Even in the cities, though. Same thing.
Yeah. And Mary Ruddick, our friend who also went to visit the Hadza, said she went to visit another Hadza tribe, and they had more white, a larger percentage of them had white teeth. And I said, what do you think it is? She didn't have a good explanation. She said they rolled their cigarettes in different paper. Like, I wonder if there's so many different factors. There's something causing this. I think we can pretty confidently say it has nothing to do with their diet. They eat a pretty good diet, right? Their teeth are either stained from fluoride, which Anthony and I talked about in the last podcast, which is certainly an issue, and can be contaminating their water supplies, and is contaminating the water supplies of many in Tanzania. Even in the cities, we saw people with many stains on the front of their teeth. And when we went to visit Gasper's school with many of the kids, they all had stains on the front of their teeth, the brown stains. And I thought, what is this? But a lot of the Hadza had very brown mouths. They smoke a lot, both tobacco and marijuana. And I thought, Mary brought up a good point. Maybe the paper they smoke it in has inks or dyes that are being inhaled that are staining their teeth. There's something they're doing that's staining their teeth. Generally, they have very good dentition connected with their what I would call an animal-based diet that's very rich in fat-soluble nutrients.
As well, again, to bring it back, no bad breath.
Yes.
There's another sign of oral health.
Yeah.
Like if you have bad breath, like something's wrong. Humans shouldn't just naturally have just reeking odor out of their mouth.
No, halitosis is clearly an indication of a problem. I spoke about this on the podcast with Stephen Lynn. You guys can go back and review that one if you want, but he's a biological dentist from Australia. But yeah, they didn't have bad breath. They just had teeth that were stained. And so a lot of people asked about that because in a lot of the videos, it was clear they had brown teeth. And I just wanted to go over that again. That it didn't have to do with their diet. It probably was just something interesting in their environment, fluoride and or other things.
I think another really fun question was how active was the hunt and how can we train to mimic their lifestyle? And so hunt was active. It was active. But again, the question is, what is normal given their 50,000 plus years? Like if they were hunting larger game that was available, like we saw in Ngorongoro Crater, how different would it be? And like,
you wouldn't have to go that far.
Yeah, and is their amount of running and their consumption of meat, does that lead to their small frames and really, really skinny bodies? And what would they look like if they grew up in an area where they didn't have to go that far? It's super interesting, but it was basically walking for a long period of time and then flat out sprinting, and then walking and then sprinting, and that's what it was. There wasn't like jogging persistence hunting, which I've heard of before, and maybe other tribes do that. I have no idea.
Yeah, I question
that. Where you run them down and you just
the
gazelle gets tired and falls and dies.
I have trouble believing that humans did that. Or if you're persistence hunting, you are walking. You know, you're not jogging all day.
Right.
You're walking 30 miles a day to get this gazelle. But you have to imagine, if you're persistence hunting, that's a lot of freaking calories you're burning walking that thing down. Like I've always questioned that.
Yeah, so I think that as far as how to train and mimic their lifestyle, I would say not a good idea for a few different reasons. One is that our lives in our zoos, our cages are shaped certain ways. And we have a lot of work to do. And generally speaking, like I think about, structuring a fitness program is generally how you're reversing all of the bullshit in a day-to-day that you're ruining from your body. which is a lot of this forward posture, being on a computer, sitting in a 90-degree angle, not getting certain joints in certain ranges of motion. And how do you build that for somebody in a Western society? Very, very different. Like, this is like, I think the only consistent thing would be move often, get in a deep squat often, and just like move in a variety of ways. These guys were running around, climbing over stuff, under stuff. And like, I don't know, probably we walked most days we were there over 10 miles. Like these people are on the move all of the time and are never sort of sitting for longer than 45 minutes or so. And when they're sitting, they're in a deep squat and not on a chair.
I do think that if they had a good kill one day, they probably would take the next day to rest.
Yeah.
And
they seemed certainly less energetic the day after we were doing this super long hunt for the baboon.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would say be careful trying to mimic a lot and saying this is good for me now that I'm just walking a lot and getting in a squat. We have a lot to unwind, and I think this is one of the areas of like, is that the best? Are we surviving or are we thriving? And I think that when it comes down to movement, training in certain ways certainly allows for better joint health over a really long period of time. And again, like, does data support that from Hadza, or is it studying Westerners? Of course, we're Westerners, and like, I've gone 32 years of my life living in the Western world. So like, that's how I'm going to apply the lens to myself. I'm not going to try to study people from the Hadza and be like, oh, should they do pull-ups? Should they do whatever to, restore joint function or joint health, or look at synovial fluid or joint surfaces? We know a lot as far as what we need to do, and we can say like weight resistance, like resistance training is super important for people in a Western world. And that's why like the Hadza aren't lifting weights. I'm not going to say people who are in Western world should not lift weights. And there's, I think, some disconnects with lifestyle and goals and outcomes.
Yeah, the context is important, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And like, what would it be like if you were in a squat your entire life? I mean, part of like resistance training, for example, is bone mass. Like that lever system on holding up your body weight when you're in a squat position versus strength training. Like, can you get the same benefits if you did that your entire life? Probably. Like, you wouldn't have a decline in bone health. It's also like a nutritional thing. How much are we offsetting with resistance training that we're not getting enough proper nutrition over the course of 80 years? And there's so many things at play here, but I can definitively say like training differently than the Hadza is okay. But also like just be aware of your environment. How are you reversing the things? And like, what is your thing? What is your training set up for? Stop trying to mimic something that's not like you in a way where like your movement environment is very, very different.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I thought about that surfing. If you want to be a good surfer, you paddle.
Yeah.
And the surfing will train you to paddle. And you might need to do some leg work every once in a while, but you're going to get strong. I mean, my back is sore. My shoulders are sore from surfing, and it's part of the environment. But
also, I was thinking about it of like trying to think about gymnastics stuff in like, how can I incorporate movement work that's the inverse of how much overuse I'm getting?
Yeah.
Again, it's not a normal human thing to be out in the waves having so much internal rotation on your shoulder over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's like, how can I open this up and get into external and like work on thoracic rotation a little bit with external movements, things like that. I mean, it's certainly good for people who are generally desk workers. It's like you have so much thoracic extension. But yeah, I mean, working through balancing out movements that are unnatural for a human, I think is really important.
Yeah. What other questions you got?
I think that was pretty much everything. Did you ever fear for your life? I think we touched on it briefly. Only at night when I landed and we had a rough thing with communication. I had a canceled flight on the way over, and I landed in the Arusha airport, the JRO airport, at like midnight. Some guys would get in my car, couldn't speak any English, had my name on a sign that was like scribbled, and I was like, oh man, this is how it ends. And I got in some shady car, and he drove me like in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't see anything that was going on. It was people, when they're in more urban areas, certainly like there's more crime because there's more desperation. People don't have resources. They're dependent on a lot of stuff, so they revert to crime. Like, you could feel that the intensity in places like Karatu and like getting stared down when the car was getting fixed, or even going through Arusha is like, it's intense, but it's a safe journey. It's a safe country overall, I'd say.
Yeah, and that kind of highlights one of the things we talked about earlier, which was we felt safer with the Hadza than we did in the city.
Absolutely.
There's nothing to be possessed or stolen or fought over, or there's no monetary system. That's just something else I wanted to reiterate there, that when there's nothing to be bought or sold, why would you steal anything from someone? You can go in the woods and make a bow for yourself.
Yeah. When there's abundance, there's no scarcity. It's like this is the way it is. Simple.
Yeah, abundance versus scarcity was clearly demonstrated in the natural world with the Hadza. And again, we're not over romanticizing them. They're not perfect. But it was demonstrated clearly versus the city. And so as we wrap up, I just want to mention this one paper, the Nicoya region of Costa Rica, a high longevity island. Although it's not an island, it's a peninsula for elderly males. We'll put it in the...
I mean, right there, it's just like misrepresentation of the... Like, have you been here? Just because you saw it was a beach, you assumed it was an island. Same thing with the fiber and the saturated fat. It's just...
Yeah, I don't know. Now, again, I talk about the blue zones in my book. I've done a podcast on the blue zones with Tommy Wood. I've debunked this and spoken out about it.
And what's your just elevator pitch there? I mean, I've seen the studies where like one birth record keeping in these places is just off the charts, like terrible. So that's one thing.
It's cherry pick, number one. I mean, it's the invention of Dan Buettner and National Geographic, and they picked 5 regions of the world: Loma Linda, Nicoya region of Costa Rica, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, and Okinawa. And they said these regions where people live longer than average. They have a higher percentage of centenarians, which is people live longer than 100 years. Well, they left out all these other regions. It's Ansel Keys reincarnate. Yeah. They left out 10 to 20 other countries.
Where were the other regions?
I mean, you could look at, there's places in the US where there are supercentenarians and centenarians. In New England, there's places in Iceland, there's places in Malaysia. Hong Kong has the highest life expectancy, or the third in the world, 86 years. They eat like 1.5 pounds of meat per day. They have the second or third highest consumption of meat in the world, and they have the second or third highest longevity overall. So there's so many regions of the world you could look at for more centenarians than average, and they clearly doesn't correlate with a higher percentage of plant foods in the diet. But that was one of Dan Buettner's suppositions, or at least his theories, that they do multiple things in these blue zones to help people live long lives. They have community, they have plant-based diets, wrong, etc. And I talked about this with my podcast with Mary Ruddock when she came on my podcast, that she talked about Icaria in Greece, where she was living and they ate a ton of meat. That's a quote.
Nose to tail.
Yeah, they ate nose to tail meats. And this study here is one of the studies that's been talking about the Nicoya region of Costa Rica. I'm going to go there. That's where we are now. We're in the Nicoya Peninsula, but there's a town called Nicoya. And in this study, they say that, again, it's only elderly males. The Nicoya advantage does not occur in females. It's independent of socioeconomic conditions. It disappears in out migrants, which means that if males leave Nicoya, they do not maintain their longevity, and comes from lower cardiovascular mortality. Nicoyans have lower levels of biomarkers of cardiovascular risk. They are also leaner, taller, and suffer fewer disabilities. 2 markers of aging and stress, telomere length, and DHEA sulfate are also more favorable. And then they go on to make their sort of editorialized comments. The Nicoya diet is prosaic, which means, I suppose, basic, and abundant in traditional foods like rice, beans, and animal protein. I don't know how Dan Buettner missed that. With low glycemic index, and they're going to do it here, guys, a high fiber content. So, if you, as I wrote about in the Carnivore Code, if you look at the diet of Nicoya specifically, the men in Nicoya eat more meat and more animal fat than the general Costa Rican population. So the way they make these blue zones is they'll look at men and females in the Nicoya region of Costa Rica and compare their life expectancy to that of overall Costa Ricans. And one of the things you can find is that in Nicoya, the men eat more animals and more animal fat than San Jose Costa Ricans or any other places in Costa Rica. So interestingly, and it even says it right here in the abstract, it's quite high in animal protein. So I don't know how, if you guys believe that blue zones substantiate the notion of plant-based diets, that's absurd. And I'll follow up with more content about actually going to Nicoya. And like I said, I'm going to have Stephen Gundry on my podcast this week. I'll release it in the future. He's an advocate for blue zones, or he's spoken about it in his book. He is from Loma Linda, which is a, quote, blue zone where they have a lot of Seventh-day Adventists and sort of religiously derived veganism and vegetarianism. But if you compare the life expectancy of those Mormons in Loma Linda, which is about 7 years greater than the average Californian, it's equivalent to that of Californian Mormons who don't shun meat. and there have been multiple papers to show this, that the longevity advantage in Loma Linda might just be due to the fact that they shun alcohol and tobacco.
Yeah.
And
have a good community.
Yeah, just like the
live in a
Mormons.
great climate.
Exactly, just like
outside a lot.
Yeah, Mormons living in California have the same advantage, but no. So the Mormons in California are a quote blue zone. They just don't live in one area. But you could call that a blue zone, and they don't shun meat at all. So the idea of longevity is certainly a great litmus test and way to indicate what humans might hope to do in their diet to live long and well. But we have to be very careful with these insidious and in my opinion, entirely incorrect notions that blue zones or longevity is in any way, shape, or form tied to plant-based diets, or conversely, that meat in any way, shape, or form shortens the length of life for humans. So, and the furthermore...
Well, mTOR, bro.
mTOR, bro. But what about mTOR, bro?
We want to open that box.
Well, this is a joke.
That's facetious comment.
Anthony's joking about mTOR, bro. I did a whole podcast on James Clement about mTOR, bro. I'll talk with Stephen Gundry about mTOR, bro. But the last thing I'll say is that in Loma Linda, there's plenty of studies that show that the reproductive quality of the males, quantified by their sperm numbers and motility, is abysmal in vegetarians and vegans compared to omnivores. So if that's a blue zone, then we have a real problem with how we make blue zones.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Not other humans.
To me, it's also the climate and the access to water, like diverse ecosystems. Like, how much does that play into it? We always just look at the simple things with nutrition.
Yeah.
Community. Like, are they all also remote places that are really hard to get to? Which means that there's genetics that have just pooled there for a long period of time that are used to that environment and have co-evolved with that ecosystem or part of that ecosystem. I would probably say, yeah.
If you look at
for most of them, it's like there tend to be islands. This paper even confused the peninsula being an island.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, humans got there, co-evolved, became part of the ecosystem. Of course, it's a normal human expectancy then at that point.
Yeah. If you look at the New England studies of centenarians, they tend to cluster certain genes that are associated with longevity, FOXO3, SIRT1, things like this. So there's also some suggestion that the centenarian communities are just people who cluster with longevity phenotypes in genes involved in insulin resistance and inflammation.
What's your take on just longevity in general, and like the obsession with humans right now to extend it to, I want to live to 150 or 175, or I'm going to live to 125. Like, this is my goal.
I think it's a little bit silly, and I think it certainly speaks to our fear of death and our fear of mortality.
It's like, no matter what you believe happens after you die, if you live to 100 or 125, either way, you're getting there.
Yeah.
And you're like on the other side of an eternal thing.
You're not going to have any friends anymore if you live that long. All of your generations are going to be dead around you.
Well, it's like, to me, it's either like your goal is to live forever, or it's not like the ultimate focus of your health journey in life. Like, I'm trying to maximize my health span.
Exactly.
Like, I just want to enjoy reality as we're experiencing it for as long as possible. But like, I have no obsession of like certain a year. Like, if that's to 90 or 100, for me, is it really a difference? I
don't think so. And I think wrapped into that conversation of longevity, hopefully, is the conversation of health span. But it's a shame because people only think about life expectancy.
Right.
They never think about health expectancy or health span. And I got so many questions. How long do the Hadza live? Why are you so obsessed with the Hadza? They live to be 200 years old? No, they live just as long as us in Western society if they make it past childhood. We talked about this in the first podcast. I believe we did. That there is a high rate of infant mortality in free-living humans because babies are born in the wild. And shit happens in the wild. And so there's a high rate of infant mortality, which skews the life expectancy. But so many times people parrot this incorrect notion that hunter-gatherers lead short lives. And it's just so wrong. If you look at them, there are plenty of elderly people who are much more vital than their contingent or their correlating, their correlates in terms of age in Western society in hunter-gatherer societies. It's clearly a squaring of the morbidity curve. I know we talked about this in the first podcast, and it's clearly a dearth of chronic disease that's contributing to that persistence of vitality. And yet people are obsessed with, I want to live so long. It's like, well, just kick ass a long time, man.
Yeah, I think the obsession with longevity in our current culture has to do with the attempt to avoid misery of chronic disease.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, if I live to 100, basically I can't have had a heart attack when I was 50.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the obsession is. And I think the obsession should be getting out of the goddamn zoo cage.
Yeah. Get out of your fucking cage, people.
Probably a good place to wrap it up.
We'll wrap it up. Thanks for coming on, brother.
All right, man.
I think the most radical thing we've both done is catch some waves.
I don't know if caught is how I would describe it, but yes.
Surfing in the ocean. Thanks, man.
All right, man.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research in books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing, and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.